I buried my father on a bitter Tuesday morning, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the ice that froze my heart when I looked across the open grave. There, in the front row of mourners, stood my husband's 28-year-old mistress. She was not hiding in the back like a shameful secret. She was standing proudly, and she was wearing my custom-tailored black Dior dress, the very same dress my father bought for me before he died. When I leaned in and confronted the man I had loved for 30 years, he did not apologize or panic. He gripped my arm tight enough to leave bruises and whispered that I should not make a scene because she belonged there now. He thought he had broken me. He thought I was just a grieving, obedient wife who would suffer in silence. He did not know that my father had changed his will 7 days before his fatal heart attack, and the first names erased from the legacy were theirs. The wind whipped violently across the sprawling green lawns of the cemetery. It carried the heavy scent of damp earth and hundreds of expensive white lilies. My father, William, was a man who commanded absolute respect in life, and his funeral was no different. He was a self-made logistics mogul who built a shipping empire from a single rusty delivery truck. He was a titan of industry, but to me, he was just Dad, the man who taught me how to read a corporate balance sheet before I could drive. The man who always told me to trust the numbers because numbers never lie. I stood at the edge of the velvet ropes, looking down at the polished mahogany casket. I am Sarah. I am 52 years old. To the outside world, I am a senior trust officer at a prestigious financial firm. But for the last 3 decades, my real full-time job was being the silent, unwavering backbone for my husband, Richard. We met in business school. We were supposed to conquer the corporate world together as equals. But when Richard was offered a grueling path to become a regional corporate director, we made a choice. Or rather, he made a choice for us. I stepped back. I took the flexible hours. I handled the late-night fevers, the parent-teacher conferences, the endless networking dinners, and the meticulously ironed suits. I sacrificed my own upward mobility so Richard could climb the ladder unburdened by domestic reality. I gave him the perfect American family life. I trusted him absolutely. Richard stood beside me now, wearing a dark bespoke suit I had picked up from the dry cleaners just 2 days ago. He played the part of the grieving son-in-law to absolute perfection. His face was set in a mask of solemn sorrow. Occasionally, he would reach out and pat my back in front of my father's business partners, playing the role of the devoted, supportive husband. I leaned into his touch, finding a small measure of comfort in his familiar presence. I was so utterly naive. The pastor stood at the head of the grave, delivering a sermon about my father's generosity and vision. His voice was a steady, rhythmic hum, but my attention began to drift. I looked across the sea of black umbrellas and morning coats. The front rows were strictly reserved for immediate family and the highest-level executives of my father's company. But there among the silver-haired board members and tearful relatives was a jarring disruption. She was young. She could not have been more than 28 years old. Her striking blonde hair was perfectly styled, falling in loose waves over her shoulders. She wore oversized dark sunglasses that hid half her face, but her bright red lipstick felt like a deliberate slap in the face at a funeral. She stood with her chin tilted up, radiating an unearned arrogance. I did not recognize her from the company. I did not know her from the country club. But it was not her face that made my breath catch in my throat. It was what she was wearing. A wave of visceral shock slammed into my chest. The air was sucked from my lungs. I blinked hard, thinking the grief and exhaustion were playing sick tricks on my mind. But as I stared, the details became undeniably clear. She was wearing a black Dior dress. It was not just any dress. It was a custom-tailored masterpiece of dark silk and intricate lace paneling. I knew every stitch of that fabric. I knew the exact weight of it. I knew the way the collar draped across the collarbone. My father had bought that dress for me in Paris during our last vacation together, just a year ago. It was a piece I cherished deeply, a symbol of his love and our shared memories. A month ago, I had searched my entire closet for it, wanting to wear it to an important charity gala. It was nowhere to be found. When I asked Richard if he had seen it, he casually suggested the dry cleaners must have misplaced it. He even offered to buy me a replacement, playing the role of the generous, providing husband. Now that very same dress was clinging to the curves of a stranger, standing less than 20 feet away from my father's casket. My heart began to pound against my ribs like a trapped bird. The rhythmic thumping filled my ears, drowning out the pastor's eulogy. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My mind raced, piecing together the fragmented clues I had ignored for months. The late-night text messages Richard claimed were from demanding clients, the sudden weekend business trips, the unfamiliar scent of sweet floral perfume lingering on his coats. I had dismissed all of it because I believed in the sanctity of our 30-year marriage. I turned my head slowly to look at Richard. His gaze was not on the pastor. His eyes were fixed directly across the grave. He was staring right at the blonde woman, and she was staring back. A subtle, almost imperceptible smirk played on her red lips. She raised a hand and casually adjusted the collar of my dress, ensuring I saw the diamond tennis bracelet sparkling on her wrist. A bracelet I had seen on Richard's credit card statement 3 months ago, which he claimed was a corporate gift for a retiring executive. The world tilted on its axis. The stench of betrayal was so thick, I could taste it in the back of my throat. This was not just infidelity. This was a calculated psychological violation. He had given my father's gift to his mistress, and he had the sheer audacity to parade her at my father's funeral. A tremor started in my hands and violently shook my entire body. I could not breathe. I leaned close to Richard, my shoulder pressing against his. My voice was a fragile, broken whisper meant only for his ears. "Richard." I breathed out the words, scraping against my dry throat. "That woman across the grave. She is wearing my Dior dress, the one my father gave me." I expected him to flinch. I expected him to act surprised or invent a frantic lie. I expected the man I had loved for decades to show a single ounce of shame. Instead, Richard did not even look at me. His expression remained a stone-cold mask of absolute indifference. He slowly lowered his arm from my waist. His large hand slid down and clamped around my upper arm. His fingers dug into my flesh with a sudden, brutal force. The grip was a clear threat, designed to inflict pain and demand submission. "Do not make a scene." His voice was a harsh, venomous hiss slicing through the space between us. "She belongs here now. Just keep your mouth shut and look at the casket." The words were a physical blow. They hit me harder than any physical strike ever could. She belongs here now. In that single horrifying second, the illusion of my life shattered into a million jagged pieces. He was not denying it. He was not hiding it. He was asserting his dominance and flaunting his betrayal in the most sacred space imaginable. He believed I was a weak, dependent woman who would simply bow her head and endure the humiliation to protect our public image. He thought 30 years of my quiet sacrifices meant I possessed no spine. The tears that had been freely flowing down my cheeks abruptly stopped. It was as if the intense, searing heat of his betrayal had evaporated every drop of sorrow in my body. The agonizing pain in my chest hardened, transforming into something else entirely. The naive, grieving daughter died in that very spot. The obedient, accommodating wife was buried right alongside my father. What took their place was a woman forged in absolute, freezing clarity. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. The platinum wedding band glinted in the gray morning light. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated disgust, but I did not scream. I did not rip my arm away. I did not give his mistress the satisfaction of seeing the devastated, hysterical wife making a fool of herself in front of high society. I slowly lifted my head and looked straight ahead. My posture straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. I forced my muscles to relax, accepting the pain of his grip without a single flinch. "I will not make a scene," I whispered back, my voice devoid of any emotion. It was as flat and cold as a frozen lake. Richard relaxed his grip slightly, perhaps believing he had successfully intimidated me into submission. He offered a brief, arrogant nod and turned his attention back to the service. He thought he had won. He thought he had complete control over my reality. He was so profoundly wrong. For the remainder of the funeral service, I stood in an icy, impenetrable silence. I listened to the prayers. I watched the cemetery workers prepare to lower the mahogany casket into the earth. I felt the cold wind biting at my face, but the fire of a newly born vengeance kept me perfectly warm. My father was a man of logistics. He always told me that every problem has a structural flaw. You just have to find the weak point and dismantle the foundation. Richard thought he was the architect of my destruction, but he did not know that my father and I shared the same relentless analytical blood. As the service concluded, the mourners began to line up to toss a handful of dirt onto the casket. Richard placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me forward, playing the perfect husband once more. I picked up a handful of damp soil. I looked down into the dark grave and made a silent promise to the man who raised me. I will not let them win, Dad, I thought to myself. I will dismantle his life piece by piece. I stepped back and watched as the blonde woman approached the grave. She walked with a sway in her hips, completely inappropriate for a funeral. The black silk of my Dior dress hugged her body. She tossed a white rose onto the casket and locked eyes with Richard. They shared a fleeting, intimate look of triumph. They believed the old man was dead, and the fortune was finally theirs to enjoy. I watched them with a terrifying calmness. Let them feel victorious. Let them revel in their arrogance. They had no idea what was waiting for them back at the estate. They did not know about the blind trust. They did not know about the updated will. And most importantly, they did not know that the woman they thought they had broken was about to execute the most ruthless audit of their entire lives. The crowd slowly dispersed, heading toward the line of black town cars, waiting to take us back to the family estate for the reception. Richard opened the door of our car for me. I slid into the leather seat, my face a serene mask. "Are you all right, Sarah?" Richard asked, his voice dripping with fake concern for the benefit of the driver. "I am perfectly fine, Richard," I replied, looking out the window at the passing city. I have never seen things more clearly in my entire life. The ride back was silent. The gears in my mind were turning, calculating every asset, every account, every property we owned. I was no longer a wife mourning a marriage. I was a senior financial officer, preparing to liquidate a toxic liability. The war had officially begun, and I was going to ensure that Richard and his little mistress lost absolutely everything. Before we reached the estate, my mind drifted back to the early days of our marriage. Richard was a junior analyst back then, charming and full of relentless ambition. I had just passed my exams with top honors. We spent our evenings in a cramped apartment, eating takeout and dreaming of the empire we would build. But ambition is a hungry ghost. The higher Richard climbed, the more his ego demanded. He needed to be the smartest man in the room. He needed the expensive suits, the luxury cars, and the constant admiration of everyone around him. I provided that for him. I curated his life. I managed our finances down to the last penny, ensuring his credit was spotless and his investment portfolio looked immaculate to his board of directors. I hosted the dinner parties that secured his promotions. I smiled at his colleagues while he took the credit for financial strategies I had mapped out for him at our kitchen table. I gave him my youth. I gave him my absolute loyalty. And in return, he took my father's last gift to me and wrapped it around the body of a woman half my age. I looked at his reflection in the tinted window of the town car. He was scrolling through his phone, a faint smile on his lips. He was probably texting her, telling her how easy it was to silence me, bragging about how much money they would soon have access to. My chest tightened, but not with sorrow. It was the sharp, precise focus of a predator. I mentally categorized our joint accounts: the primary checking, the high-yield savings, the mutual funds, the retirement portfolios. Richard thought he controlled the money because he was the one bringing home the massive corporate bonuses. But I was the trust officer. I was the one who structured the accounts. I knew every password, every routing number, every hidden loophole. The town car turned onto the long tree-lined driveway of my father's estate. The sprawling stone mansion stood proudly against the gray sky. It was a monument to decades of hard work and uncompromising integrity. My father despised laziness and he loathed deceit. He always told me that a thief will always slip up because greed makes people sloppy. Richard was sloppy. He was so blinded by his own narcissism that he brought his mistress to a funeral filled with people who knew my father. He thought he was untouchable. The car stopped at the grand entrance. Richard pocketed his phone and turned to me, his face shifting back into the sorrowful husband persona. "We just need to get through this afternoon, Sarah," he said softly, placing a hand over mine. "Thomas will read the will, and then we can finally focus on us. On our future." I looked down at his hand resting on top of mine. The skin was warm, but his touch made my blood run cold. I slowly pulled my hand away, smoothing the fabric of my skirt. "Yes, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly even. "We will see exactly what the future holds very soon." I stepped out of the car and walked into the estate. The grand foyer was already filling with guests. I scanned the room. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The low hum of polite conversation echoed off the marble floors. And then I saw her again. Chloe was standing near the large fireplace, holding a crystal flute of champagne. She had removed her sunglasses, revealing striking blue eyes and a flawless, youthful face. My black Dior dress fit her perfectly, a cruel reminder of the physical intimacy she shared with my husband. She was chatting with one of Richard's junior executives, laughing softly at something he said. Richard quickly moved to my side, hovering like a protective shadow. But I knew he was not protecting me from the grief. He was managing the situation. He was making sure the two women in his life did not cross paths in front of the guests. I walked past them, heading straight for my father's private study. I needed a moment of silence to compose myself before the reading of the will. I needed to lock away every ounce of my pain and channel it into pure strategic execution. I closed the heavy oak door of the study and leaned against it. The room smelled of old paper-rich leather and my father's favorite pipe tobacco. I walked over to his massive mahogany desk and ran my fingers along the polished surface. "I will make them pay, Dad," I whispered into the empty room. "I will strip them of their dignity, their money, and their arrogant pride. They wanted to steal your legacy and mock your daughter. I will ensure they leave with nothing but the clothes on their backs." I took a deep breath, centering myself. The tears were gone. The heartbreak was replaced by an unbreakable iron will. I straightened my posture, unlocked the door, and walked back out into the lion's den. I was ready to face my husband. I was ready to face his mistress. And I was absolutely ready to watch their arrogant world burn to ash. The heavy iron gates of my father's estate swung open with a slow, metallic groan. Our black town car glided up the long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees. This was the house where I grew up. It was a sprawling stone mansion in the wealthy suburbs of Chicago. My father built this place with the sweat and blood of a lifetime of relentless work. Today, it felt like a museum waiting for a new curator. Richard sat beside me in the back seat. He was busy adjusting his silk tie and checking his reflection in the tinted window. He did not look like a man who had just buried his father-in-law. He looked like a man preparing for a victory lap. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded in my lap. My mind was entirely focused on the icy calm settling over my heart. The betrayal at the cemetery had burned away the last remnants of my grief. Now there was only the sharp precision of a woman ready to dismantle her husband's life. The car stopped at the grand entrance. Richard stepped out and offered me his hand, playing the role of the devoted husband for the valet and the arriving guests. I ignored his hand and stepped out on my own. I walked through the massive double doors into the grand foyer. The house was already filled with the low murmur of catered mourning. Waiters carried trays of expensive wine and hors d'oeuvres. Board members and distant relatives offered me pitiful glances and sympathetic nods. I accepted their condolences with a practiced, polite smile, but my eyes were scanning the room. I was hunting for the two people who thought they had made a fool out of me. It did not take me long to find them. Richard and Chloe were standing in the far corner of the formal living room near the grand piano. They were huddled close together in a way that screamed intimacy to anyone paying attention. Chloe was still wearing my black Dior dress. Seeing it inside my father's house felt like a physical violation. She held a glass of champagne delicately between her manicured fingers. Richard was leaning down slightly, whispering into her ear. A smug, confident smile stretched across his face. I moved closer, slipping behind a tall marble pillar adorned with white lilies. They did not notice me. They were completely absorbed in their own arrogance. I stood in the shadows and listened to the murmurs of my husband and his 28-year-old mistress. Richard was speaking in a low, excited tone. He told her that this was the moment they had been waiting for. He said that with my father gone, the primary trust would finally be dissolved and the liquid assets would fall directly into our joint accounts. He promised her that the first thing he would do is allocate $5 million to fund his new independent consulting venture. Chloe smiled brightly, running a hand down the side of my stolen dress. She asked him how long it would take to liquidate the older properties so they could start looking at houses in the Hamptons. Richard chuckled and assured her it would take no time at all because he had me completely under his control. He said I was too fragile and overwhelmed by grief to care about the financial details. He actually called me a gullible housewife who only cared about keeping up appearances. Listening to him dismiss 30 years of my loyalty and hard work as the traits of a gullible housewife sent a surge of pure adrenaline through my veins. He thought I was just a blind, obedient servant. He forgot that I was a senior trust officer. He forgot that I was my father's daughter. I memorized every word they whispered. I cataloged their greedy plans. Let them dream. Let them build their castles in the sky. I knew the ground they were standing on was about to be pulled out from under them. A sharp clearing of a throat echoed over the chatter in the room. Thomas stepped into the living room. Thomas was my father's estate attorney and his oldest friend. He was a tall, imposing man in a tailored navy suit with sharp eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He carried a thick leather briefcase that held the final wishes of a logistics empire. Thomas looked across the room and his eyes met mine. He gave a single, solemn nod. It was time. Thomas announced that the immediate family needed to gather in the library for the reading of the will. The room grew quiet as the guests respectfully stepped aside. Richard immediately straightened his posture and walked over to me. He placed a heavy hand on my lower back, attempting to guide me toward the library like a shepherd guiding a docile sheep. I walked forward, letting him believe he was in charge. We entered the dark mahogany library. The scent of old books and pipe tobacco immediately brought a fresh wave of memories of my father. I took a seat in a high-backed leather chair facing the massive desk. Richard sat right next to me. Before Thomas could close the heavy oak doors, Chloe slipped into the room. She stood near the doorway, crossing her arms and looking around the library as if she were inspecting property she was about to purchase. Thomas frowned deeply. He looked at Chloe and stated firmly that this was a private legal proceeding for the immediate family only. He asked her to leave. Richard quickly stood up, puffing out his chest. He told Thomas that Chloe was a vital member of his executive support team and that she needed to be present to assist him with the complex financial transitions. He was bringing his mistress to the reading of my father's will. The sheer audacity of his actions was staggering. I looked at Thomas. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I simply nodded and said she could stay. I wanted her to stay. I wanted the woman wearing my dress to witness every single second of the destruction that was about to unfold. Thomas took his seat behind the desk and opened his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of crisp white documents sealed with the official stamp of the law firm. Richard leaned forward in his chair. He laced his fingers together, resting his elbows on his knees. His eyes were wide and hungry. He was vibrating with greedy anticipation. He truly believed he was about to be handed the keys to a billion-dollar kingdom. Thomas began to read the standard legal preamble. He went over the minor bequests to charities and loyal employees. Richard tapped his foot impatiently. He did not care about the charities. He wanted the primary estate. Then Thomas paused. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Richard. The silence in the library became thick and suffocating. Thomas stated that regarding the primary estate, the corporate holdings, and the liquid investment portfolios, there had been a recent and significant change. He read aloud that my father, William, being of sound mind and body, had completely revoked all previous iterations of his last will and testament. Richard stopped tapping his foot. His brow furrowed in confusion. Chloe lowered her arms and stared at the desk. Thomas continued reading clearly and deliberately. He announced that this updated document was executed exactly 7 days prior to my father's death. Thomas read the exact phrasing. Let it be known that my son-in-law, Richard, is completely and permanently removed from all corporate succession plans, all executive boards, and all financial trusts. He is to receive absolutely no share of my personal wealth, no share of the business equity, and no access to any marital funds derived from my estate. Richard is hereby granted nothing. The word nothing echoed in the large room. $0, 0 power, 0 assets. Richard's jaw went completely slack. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, pale ghost. He stared at Thomas as if the attorney had just spoken in a foreign language. For a full 10 seconds, the room was absolutely silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Then Richard jumped out of his chair. His face quickly transitioned from pale to a mottled, furious red. He shouted that it was impossible. He yelled that it was a mistake. He claimed that he and my father had discussed the business transition just last month. He insisted that my father had promised him the operational capital for his new venture and the executive seat on the board. He accused Thomas of reading a fraudulent document. Thomas did not flinch. He looked at Richard with a gaze full of sheer professional contempt. He assured Richard that the document was fully authenticated, notarized, and legally ironclad. Thomas explained that my father had been extremely specific in his instructions. My father had come to the law office precisely 1 week ago and demanded an immediate total restructuring of his estate to cut Richard out entirely. By the door, Chloe let out a sharp, audible gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth. The arrogant smirk she had worn all day completely vanished. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. She looked at the expensive paintings on the walls, then at the diamond bracelet on her wrist, and finally at Richard. She realized in that exact moment that the wealthy, powerful man she was sleeping with had just been stripped of the very fortune he promised her. The lavish lifestyle she thought she had secured was evaporating before her eyes. Richard turned to me, his eyes frantic and pleading. He begged me to fix this. He demanded that I tell Thomas it was a mistake and that we needed those assets to secure our future. I slowly stood up. I looked at the man I had served for 3 decades. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt only the icy thrill of ultimate control. I told Richard that I believed Thomas had just told us exactly what my father wanted. I reminded him that my father was a brilliant man who knew how to identify a liability. Richard looked like he was going to be physically sick. He stumbled backward, gripping the back of his chair for support. He turned and stormed past Chloe, rushing out of the library and slamming the heavy oak doors behind him. Chloe hesitated for a second, her eyes wide with panic, before she turned and chased after him, her high heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. The heavy doors clicked shut. The library was quiet again. I stood there breathing in the scent of old paper and tobacco. I had won the first battle, but I knew this war was far from over. Thomas let out a long, heavy sigh. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at me and announced that I was granted full control of a newly established blind trust containing the entirety of the estate. Then, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. The paper was crisp and white, with my name written across the front in my father's sharp, familiar handwriting. Thomas handed it to me and said my father had asked him to give this to me in absolute privacy. I broke the wax seal and opened the flap. Inside was a small black metallic flash drive. Beneath the flash drive was a single piece of heavy cardstock. I pulled the note out and unfolded it. The message was short, but it carried the force of a nuclear bomb. I read the words silently, and a chilling electric jolt shot straight down my spine. The note read, "Sarah checked the Cayman accounts. He did not just break your heart. He broke the law." The heavy oak doors of my father's library clicked shut behind me. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room. The air was thick with the familiar scent of rich leather-bound books and my father's signature cherry pipe tobacco. Just outside those doors, the reception was in full swing. I could hear the muffled clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of wealthy mourners exchanging meaningless pleasantries. Among them was my husband of 30 years, mingling with his 28-year-old mistress, who was currently draped in my stolen custom Dior dress. My chest tightened painfully. A suffocating wave of grief and humiliation threatened to pull me under. But I looked down at the small black metallic flash drive resting in the palm of my hand. I felt its cold, hard edges pressing into my skin. My father had left me a map. He had left me a weapon, and he expected me to use it. I walked around the massive mahogany desk and sat in his high-backed leather executive chair. I took a slow, deep breath. I commanded my lungs to expand. I ordered my heart to slow its frantic beating. The woman who had wept at the cemetery just an hour ago was gone. The obedient, supportive wife who had sacrificed her own career for her husband's ambition no longer existed. In her place sat a senior trust officer with 30 years of financial expertise and a newly ignited fire of pure, methodical rage. I reached for my father's sleek silver laptop resting on the desk. I flipped it open and typed in the administrative password he and I had shared for over a decade. The screen illuminated the dark wood of the desk. I inserted the black flash drive into the port. A prompt appeared asking for a decryption key. I typed in the name of my childhood dog, exactly as my father's handwritten note had instructed. A progress bar flashed across the screen, and then a single master folder opened. It was labeled with Richard's full legal name. I clicked on the folder. Dozens of subfolders populated the screen. They were meticulously organized by year quarter and account type. My father had always been a man who trusted numbers more than words. He built his logistics empire on the foundation of absolute precision. He despised liars, and he hunted thieves with terrifying efficiency. As I opened the first spreadsheet, a cold shiver ran down my spine. This was not just a collection of bank statements. It was a comprehensive forensic audit conducted by my father's private investigative team over the last 6 months of his life. I opened the file containing the corporate ledgers for the holding company's regional division. This was the exact division where Richard served as regional corporate director. The position I had helped him secure by coaching him through every major interview and drafting his strategic proposals. I scrolled through the line items for the fiscal year of 2023. My trained eyes scanned the rows of data, looking for the anomalies. It did not take long to find them. There were recurring monthly payments to a third-party logistics consulting firm based in the Cayman Islands. The firm was called Apex Global Solutions. The payments started small, at $25,000 a month. But by the second year, they had ballooned to over $150,000 a month. I pulled up the vendor approval forms attached in the subfolder. Every single one of them bore Richard's digital executive signature. He had authorized every transfer. I dug deeper into the corporate registry files my father had compiled. Apex Global Solutions was a ghost company. It had no physical office, no legitimate employee payroll, and no record of actually rendering any services to my father's logistics empire. The registered agent for the shell company was a proxy firm, but the ultimate beneficial owner was hidden behind a web of offshore trusts. However, my father's investigators had pierced the corporate veil. They tracked the routing numbers from the Cayman accounts directly back to a private wealth management account in Zurich. I opened the corresponding document. The Zurich account was registered under a dual mandate. The primary account holder was Richard. The secondary signatory was his 28-year-old mistress, Chloe. The sheer audacity of his crime made my stomach turn. He was not just cheating on me. He was actively stealing from the company my father had built from nothing. I highlighted the total sum transferred over the past 36 months. The number glared back at me in bold black font. $4.2 million. My husband had embezzled over $4 million of corporate funds while smiling at my father across the Thanksgiving dinner table. He had sat in our living room complaining about tight regional budgets and corporate restructuring, all while quietly siphoning millions into a secret overseas account. I remembered how he told me we needed to delay upgrading our kitchen last year because he wanted to be conservative with our savings. I remembered how I had carefully managed our household budget clipping coupons and delaying my own purchases to ensure we met his strict financial goals. I had been playing the role of the frugal, supportive wife while he was funneling a fortune to a woman young enough to be our daughter. The betrayal was so deep, so entirely pervasive, that it felt as though the very floor beneath me had dropped away. But the flash drive was not empty yet. There was another folder labeled Personal Assets and Liabilities. I hovered my cursor over the icon. My heart pounded a heavy, rhythmic warning in my chest. If the corporate theft was the earthquake, what I was about to find was the tsunami. I double-clicked the folder. The first document was a PDF of a property deed. I opened it and scanned the text. It was a deed for a luxury townhouse located in the most exclusive high-rise district downtown. The purchase price was listed at $2.8 million. The transaction had been completed entirely in cash just 4 months ago. I looked at the name of the sole registered owner. It was not Richard. It was Chloe. My husband had purchased a multi-million-dollar home for his mistress outright. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, gasping for air. The math did not make sense. Even with the $4.2 million stashed in the Zurich account, tying up nearly $3 million in a single real estate transaction would have triggered massive red flags in his liquid asset portfolio. Where did he get that much upfront capital without touching the offshore funds? I quickly clicked on the next document in the folder. It was a loan origination file from a major national bank. I scrolled down to the property used as collateral. It was my house. The sprawling suburban home where I had raised our family, where I had planted every rosebush in the garden, where I had hosted every neighborhood holiday party. I stared at the screen, my eyes wide with absolute horror. It was a second mortgage taken out against the equity of our marital home. The loan amount was exactly $2.8 million. But our home was fully paid off, and the deed was held jointly in both of our names. He could not legally encumber the property without my explicit notarized consent. I scrolled frantically to the signature page of the loan document. There at the bottom of the page next to Richard's signature was my own. My name was signed in a perfect fluid cursive. It was my exact signature, but I had never seen this document before in my entire life. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Richard had forged my signature. He had falsified notarization documents using a corrupt contact. He had secretly leveraged the entire equity of my safe suburban home to buy a luxury downtown townhouse for his mistress. If he defaulted on that secret loan, the bank would foreclose on my house. He had quite literally gambled the roof over my head to provide a glamorous lifestyle for a woman who was right outside this very door, drinking my father's champagne and wearing my stolen clothes. A violent surge of nausea rose in my throat. I pushed my chair back and bent over, taking sharp, ragged breaths until the feeling passed. My own husband had financially weaponized my trust. He had spent 3 decades studying me, learning my habits, and realizing exactly how much blind faith I placed in him. He knew I handled the day-to-day household bills while he managed the large-scale investments and property taxes. He knew I would never think to pull the title records on a home we had paid off 10 years ago. He had exploited my devotion to fund his treacherous double life. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk until my knuckles turned completely white. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to storm out of the library. I wanted to march into the grand foyer, grab Richard by his expensive silk tie, and drag him in front of every single executive and family member present. I wanted to project these documents onto a massive screen. I wanted to scream his crimes until my voice went hoarse. I wanted to see the smug, arrogant smile wiped off Chloe's face as the police arrived to arrest him for felony forgery and corporate embezzlement. The urge to confront him right in the middle of my father's wake was almost overpowering. But I am a senior trust officer. My entire career was built on risk assessment, crisis management, and strategic execution. I forced myself to look away from the door and stare back at the glowing screen of the laptop. If I confronted Richard right now, I would be acting on pure emotion. I would be showing my hand before the trap was fully set. Richard was a cornered animal who had just realized my father had cut him out of the primary will. If he knew I possessed the forensic proof of his federal crimes, he would panic. He could immediately log into the Zurich accounts and wire the $4 million to a non-extradition jurisdiction. He could destroy the digital trails on his personal devices. He could contact his corrupt notary and fabricate a story claiming I had willingly signed the second mortgage but forgot due to grief. I could not afford to give him a single second to mount a defense or hide the remaining assets. I needed to be smarter than my anger. I needed to be colder than his betrayal. To completely destroy him, I had to let him believe he was still the smartest man in the room. I had to let him think I was still the clueless, devastated widow who desperately needed her husband's guidance to navigate my father's complex estate. I had to wear the mask of the gullible wife until I had quietly positioned every legal and financial mechanism to obliterate his life. I reached out and carefully ejected the black flash drive from the laptop. I closed the screen and slipped the drive deep into the hidden zippered pocket of my purse. I stood up and smoothed the front of my black skirt. I walked over to the antique mirror hanging above the fireplace. I stared at my reflection. My eyes were red from crying at the cemetery, but my posture was rigid and unyielding. I practiced a soft, trembling sigh. I let my shoulders slump forward slightly, mimicking the heavy burden of sorrow and confusion. I perfected the face of a woman who had just lost her father and was entirely dependent on her husband. I turned the brass handle of the heavy oak door and stepped back out into the crowded hallway, ready to play my part. The morning sun filtered through the heavy silk drapes of my suburban home, but it brought absolutely no warmth to the room. I sat alone at the massive marble kitchen island, gripping a ceramic mug of black coffee. I had not slept a single wink. My mind had spent the entire night running through the forensic audit I discovered on my father's hidden flash drive. $4.2 million embezzled over the course of 36 months. A luxury townhouse purchased in the city for a 28-year-old mistress using a forged second mortgage on the very house I was sitting in. My husband Richard was a monster. He was a thief who had masqueraded as a loving partner for 3 decades. But as I was about to learn, a monster rarely operates completely alone. They require enablers. They require accomplices to help them hide their dirty tracks. The sudden shrill chime of the doorbell shattered the quiet morning. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my racing heart to calm down. I walked over to the front door and pulled it open. Standing on my porch, holding a bakery box of expensive pastries, was Richard's older sister, Brenda. Brenda was a woman who prided herself on maintaining the absolute perfect suburban image. She wore a pristine beige cashmere sweater, and her blonde hair was sprayed perfectly into place. She had always played the role of the loving, supportive sister-in-law. For 30 years, I had hosted her family for Thanksgiving dinners, bought her children lavish Christmas gifts, and treated her like my own blood. I had trusted her completely. "Oh, Sarah, you poor sweet thing." Brenda cooed, stepping into the foyer and wrapping her arms tightly around my shoulders. Her perfume was overwhelming, a cloying mixture of heavy vanilla and synthetic roses. I stood completely rigid in her embrace, fighting the intense visceral urge to push her away. She pulled back and looked at me with wide, exaggerated eyes filled with fake sympathy. "I am so incredibly sorry about your father. I know how much you relied on him for everything. I came over the second Richard told me about the will reading. You must be just absolutely devastated by the shock." I guided her into the kitchen, keeping my posture slightly slumped. I needed her to believe I was entirely broken by grief and confusion. I poured her a cup of coffee and watched her settle into a leather bar stool. Brenda let out a long, dramatic sigh and reached across the marble counter to gently pat my hand. "Richard is just falling apart, Sarah," Brenda said, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial, emotional whisper. "He loved your father like his own flesh and blood." "And that will reading yesterday? Well, it was just a terrible shock to his system. We all know your father was not in his right mind during those final days. Cutting Richard out completely after decades of loyal service to the company is simply irrational. It is an insult to everything Richard has built for your family." I stared at her manicured fingers resting on top of my own. My father was the sharpest man I ever knew until the very minute his heart stopped beating. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew Richard was stealing. But I kept my face smooth and completely blank, playing the part of the devoted but confused wife. Richard is so stressed. Brenda continued, her eyes scanning my face for a reaction. He is trying to keep the regional division afloat while dealing with this massive personal insult. And you know, he has that new independent consulting venture. He has been working so hard to launch. He desperately needs liquidity right now, Sarah. He needs cash flow to secure his contracts and keep the business running smoothly. I know the lawyer said you have unilateral control of the blind trust now. It would be the right thing to do to transfer a lump sum to his personal accounts. Just to tide him over. Just to ease the immense burden on your poor husband. I felt a cold, dark realization creeping into the back of my mind. Brenda was not here to comfort me. She was here as a financial scout. Richard had sent his sister to manipulate the grieving widow into handing over the trust funds. They thought I was a foolish housewife who would blindly sign a wire transfer just to keep the peace in my marriage. They underestimated me entirely. I do not know, Brenda, I whispered, letting my voice tremble perfectly. The lawyers told me the trust is very complex and highly regulated. I am just so overwhelmed by everything happening so fast. Brenda smiled a tight, predatory smile. She squeezed my hand harder, her fake sympathy morphing into aggressive persuasion. You do not need to worry about the complex legalities, Sarah. Richard can handle all of that for you. You just need to sign the release forms. It is your money now. You can do whatever you want with it. Do not let those greedy corporate lawyers bully you into holding out on your own husband when he needs you the most. As she spoke, she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone, setting it face up on the counter. She had forgotten that her phone was programmed to automatically connect to our home wireless network whenever she visited. I watched the tiny wireless icon at the top of her screen turn solid black, indicating a successful connection. A split second later, the screen illuminated brightly with a notification. My eyes naturally darted to the glowing rectangle. The text was large and impossible to miss. It was a message from a contact saved simply as Chloe. The name hit me like a physical punch to the gut. It was the same name as the young blonde woman who had stood at my father's grave wearing my stolen Dior dress. The same woman who was living in a $2.8 million townhouse financed by my forged signature. I read the preview text on Brenda's lock screen before it faded into blackness. The message said, "Did she sign the release yet? Richard needs the cash for the closing costs on the yacht by Friday. Let me know when the idiot widow transfers the funds." The air vanished from my lungs. A visceral shock slammed into my chest, making my heart pound furiously against my ribs. I felt a sudden sickening chill run down my spine. The idiot widow, that is what they called me. But it was not just the insult that made my blood turn to ice. It was the undeniable proof of Brenda's absolute complicity. Richard's sister was not just aware of the affair. She was actively participating in it. She was communicating directly with his mistress. She was coordinating their financial schemes and tracking my money for them. I forced myself to look away from the blank screen of her phone. I looked up at Brenda's face. She was still smiling at me, sipping her coffee, completely unaware that her digital slip-up had just exposed her entire treacherous soul. My mind began to race, rapidly connecting the dots I had blindly ignored for years. Brenda had never held a high-paying job, but 2 years ago, she suddenly purchased a lavish vacation home in Florida. She claimed she had made a brilliant return on a lucky stock investment, but I knew the truth now. I remembered the forensic audit I had uncovered the night before. I remembered the millions of dollars funneled from my father's company into offshore shell accounts. Richard could not have set up the complex Cayman Island banking structures entirely by himself. He needed a proxy. He needed someone with a different last name to act as the registered agent for the dummy corporations to avoid drawing corporate suspicion. Brenda was the proxy. She had helped her brother launder my father's stolen money. She had profited immensely from the embezzlement. She was standing in my kitchen, drinking my coffee and smiling at my face while helping her brother and his mistress bleed me completely dry. A burning, intense fury ignited deep within my chest, but I buried it instantly. I could not afford to lose my temper. If I confronted her right now, she would delete the messages. She would warn Richard. They would scramble to hide the remaining assets before I could legally freeze them. I had to maintain my disguise. I had to be the gullible, submissive woman they all thought I was. "You are right, Brenda," I said, letting a fake tear slip down my cheek. I wiped it away with the back of my hand, sniffing softly. Richard has always taken such good care of our family. I should not let the lawyers dictate how we handle our money. I want to help him. I really do. Brenda's eyes lit up with sheer greedy triumph. She leaned forward eagerly, dropping all pretense of mourning. "That is wonderful, Sarah. That is exactly what a good wife should do. I will tell Richard to have his legal team draft the release papers tonight. You can just sign them tomorrow, and everything will be perfectly fine. We will get through this crisis together." "I will think about the exact amount today," I promised, keeping my voice hesitant and soft. "I need to review the liquid accounts first, but you can tell Richard I am fully open to the transfer. I just need a little time to clear my head and understand the balances." "Of course, take your time, sweetie," Brenda cooed, visibly thrilled by her apparent victory. She picked up her phone and slid it back into her handbag, oblivious to the fatal error she had just made. "I am just going to use your powder room quickly before I head out to run some errands." She stood up and clicked her heels down the hallway toward the guest bathroom. The moment the bathroom door clicked shut, my demeanor shifted instantly. The grieving widow vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating senior trust officer. I moved with silent, absolute precision. I pulled my own phone from my pocket and opened the administrator application for our home wireless router. Because Brenda's phone was currently connected to my network, I could view her device details in the active client list. I quickly located her phone's profile among the connected devices. I tapped on the Information tab and copied her unique media access control address. The MAC address was the permanent digital fingerprint of her device. I pasted the sequence of letters and numbers into a secure encrypted file on my phone. With this specific address, I could use my professional forensic software to intercept her unencrypted cloud backups. I would not just read her messages. I would download every photograph, every bank routing number, and every digital receipt she had ever shared with Richard and Chloe. She thought she was manipulating a fool, but she had just handed me the master key to their entire criminal network. I closed the application and slipped my phone back into my pocket just as the bathroom door opened. Brenda walked back into the kitchen, reapplying her expensive lipstick. She looked completely satisfied with her morning's work. "I will let you get some rest, Sarah," Brenda said, walking toward the front door. "I will call Richard right now and give him the good news. He will be so relieved to know you are cooperating. Just remember, we are all family here. We have to stick together no matter what happens." I followed her to the door and offered a weak, grateful smile. "Thank you for coming, Brenda. I really appreciate your guidance during this difficult time." She gave me one last tight hug, her cheap vanilla perfume clinging to my clothes. She stepped out onto the porch and walked down the driveway toward her luxury sport utility vehicle. A vehicle that was undoubtedly paid for with my father's stolen money. I stood in the doorway and watched her drive away. The morning air was crisp and completely still. My heart was no longer racing. My hands were no longer trembling. The initial shock of the betrayal had entirely faded, leaving behind a solid, indestructible resolve. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought I was an obstacle they could easily manage with fake sympathy and sweet words. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you corner a woman who understands numbers better than she understands forgiveness. I closed the heavy front door and locked the deadbolt. I walked back into the silent kitchen and poured the rest of the coffee down the drain. I had a lot of work to do. I had to trace offshore accounts. I had to intercept cloud data. I had to build a legal cage so tight that neither Richard nor his treacherous sister would ever see the light of day as free citizens again. The idiot widow was going to work. And when I was finished, there would be absolutely nothing left of their arrogant little lives. 2 days had passed since my sister-in-law sat in my kitchen and smiled at my face while actively helping my husband steal my father's fortune. 2 entire days of existing in a house that suddenly felt like an active crime scene. I had not slept a single hour. My mind was a relentless machine, processing the raw data I had extracted from Brenda's digital cloud backups. Every text message, every offshore routing number, every photograph of Richard and Chloe vacationing in St. Bart's while I was sitting by my father's hospital bed was permanently burned into my memory. But the tears were completely gone. The devastating heartbreak that had threatened to suffocate me at the cemetery had hardened into a block of absolute freezing ice. I was no longer a grieving daughter or a betrayed wife. I was an auditor, and I was building a cage. Today was the annual Spring Hope Charity Luncheon at the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was an exclusive event filled with the wealthiest families in the city, including many of my father's oldest business associates. Ordinarily, a woman who had just buried her father would stay home and mourn in private. Richard had certainly expected me to stay locked inside our suburban house, weeping into my pillows. He had kissed my forehead this morning and told me to rest while he went to the corporate office to handle some urgent regional division crises. I knew he was not going to the office. I knew from the intercepted text messages that he was meeting his lawyers to figure out how to bypass the blind trust my father had established. I could not stay home. Hiding away would signal weakness. It would signal that I was exactly the fragile, broken woman they all thought I was. I needed to maintain the perfect illusion of the clueless, loyal wife. I needed them to believe I was entirely dependent on their guidance. So I sat at my vanity and applied my makeup like a soldier preparing for battle. I chose a conservative dark navy dress that commanded respect, but still spoke of mourning. I clasped a simple string of pearls around my neck. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and practiced my expression. I softened the hard, predatory focus in my eyes. I let my shoulders drop slightly to mimic the heavy burden of profound grief. I looked like a woman who was barely holding her life together. It was a flawless performance. I drove my car to the country club and handed the keys to the young valet. The heavy glass doors swung open and the familiar scent of expensive floral arrangements and roasted duck washed over me. The grand dining room was a sea of pastel spring dresses and tailored suits. The moment I stepped inside, the lively chatter noticeably dimmed. Heads turned in my direction. I could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes assessing my grief. I kept my chin level and walked gracefully toward my designated table near the front stage. The next hour was a grueling exercise in supreme psychological endurance. Older women adorned in heavy jewelry came over to squeeze my hand and offer their hollow condolences. They told me how much my father would be missed. They asked how Richard was coping with the immense pressure of stepping up to lead the family. Every time someone mentioned my husband's name, a sickening wave of disgust rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down perfectly. I smiled a sad, gentle smile and told them that Richard was my absolute rock. I played the part of the devoted, submissive wife to absolute perfection. The waiters began clearing the salad plates when a sudden shift in the room's energy caught my attention. The polite murmuring at the tables near the entrance abruptly stopped, replaced by sharp whispers and the subtle turning of heads. I looked toward the arched doorway and felt my blood run completely cold. It was Chloe. She did not belong to this country club. She did not run in these social circles. Yet she was striding right into the grand dining room as if she owned the entire building. She was wearing a blindingly white tailored designer suit that clung to every curve of her youthful body. The white fabric was a deliberate, arrogant contrast to the dark mourning clothes I was wearing. Her blonde hair was swept over one shoulder in perfect cascading waves. She was practically vibrating with an unearned, triumphant energy. She was here as the guest of a junior executive's wife, but it was entirely obvious why she had really come. She was hunting for me. She wanted to mark her territory. She wanted to look the defeated wife in the eye and revel in her stolen victory. I watched her navigate the room with a sickening sway in her hips. She was dripping in expensive jewelry. Diamonds sparkled on her wrists and ears, catching the light from the massive crystal chandeliers above. Those diamonds were bought and paid for with the money my husband had systematically drained from my father's life work. A fierce burning heat flared in my chest, but I clamped down on it instantly. I took a slow sip of my iced water and placed the glass back on the table. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I waited until the main course was served before I quietly excused myself from the table. I walked across the dining room, keeping my gaze fixed straight ahead. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the women's powder room and stepped inside. The restroom was a lavish sanctuary of white marble, gold fixtures, and soft ambient lighting. I walked over to the long vanity mirror and turned on the brass faucet. I let the cold water run over my wrists, taking slow, deliberate breaths to keep my heart rate completely steady. The heavy oak door clicked open behind me, and the sharp, rhythmic tapping of stiletto heels echoed against the marble floor. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. The suffocating scent of sweet floral perfume filled the small space instantly. Chloe walked up to the vanity and stood directly next to me. She placed a silver designer clutch on the marble counter and pulled out a tube of bright red lipstick. We stared at each other in the massive mirror. The silence between us was heavy and thick with toxic electricity. "You look incredibly tired, Sarah," Chloe said casually, uncapping her lipstick. Her voice was smooth and laced with venomous pity. "I suppose losing your father and realizing you are entirely alone in the world takes a severe toll on a woman your age." I turned off the faucet and picked up a thick white towel to dry my hands. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice. I looked at her reflection with the mild, confused expression of a grieving widow. "It has been a very difficult week," I replied, my voice soft and unassuming. "But I am not alone. I have Richard." Chloe let out a sharp, cruel laugh. The sound bounced off the marble walls, grating against my ears. She leaned closer to the mirror and carefully applied the red color to her lips. "Yes, Richard," she sneered. "He is such a generous man. But you have to admit, Sarah, he is absolutely exhausted. He has spent years pretending to care about your little domestic life while building a massive empire. He is tired of playing the dutiful husband to a woman who cannot even keep up with his ambitions. He needs a partner who matches his energy. Someone young, someone vibrant. Someone who actually belongs in the future he is building." She turned her head and looked directly at me. The sheer audacity of her presence was staggering. She was standing in a room, surrounded by my social circle, wearing jewelry bought with my money, and she was looking at me like I was a pathetic nuisance standing in her way. "I understand that you are in a state of shock over the will." Chloe continued stepping away from the mirror and closing the distance between us. "Richard told me everything about the blind trust. He told me how your father tried to punish him, but you and I both know that money belongs to Richard. He earned it while you were sitting at home, doing absolutely nothing. And we are going to get it back." I stood perfectly still, letting her talk. I was documenting every word, every arrogant admission. She was hanging herself with her own tongue, and she was entirely too stupid to realize it. "But that is just business," Chloe said, waving her hand dismissively. "I am here to talk to you about the house." I raised an eyebrow, allowing a flicker of genuine confusion to show on my face. "My house." "Yes, your massive empty suburban house." Chloe smiled, crossing her arms over her white suit jacket. "Richard and I were talking last night. That house is simply too big for a lonely older woman to manage all by herself. It is practically a mausoleum now. We need you to pack your things and move out quietly by the end of the month. You can take one of the smaller apartments downtown. Richard will even pay the first year of rent for you, out of the goodness of his heart." A cold, tight knot formed in my stomach. She was demanding that I leave the home I had paid for. The home where I had planted the gardens and painted the walls. The home Richard had secretly leveraged to buy her a downtown townhouse. Why would I ever leave my own home? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "Because we need the space, Sarah." Chloe stepped closer until she was mere inches away from my face. Her blue eyes were wide with malicious triumph. She reached down and rested her manicured hand flat against her stomach. Her red lips curled into a vicious, predatory smile. "We need the space for the nursery." She whispered the words sliding through the air like a poisoned blade. "I am pregnant, Sarah. I am carrying Richard's son. He is finally going to have the family he always wanted. the real family that you were entirely too broken to give him. The powder room went completely silent. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to vanish. The world stopped spinning. Her words hit the deepest, most agonizing wound I possessed. Years ago, during the first decade of our marriage, Richard and I had tried desperately to have children. I had endured countless rounds of agonizing fertility treatments. I had taken the hormone injections, suffered through the emotional crashes, and wept bitterly in empty hospital rooms when every single test came back negative. Richard had sat beside my hospital bed, holding my hand and whispering that it was okay. He told me that we did not need children to be happy. He told me that I was more than enough for him. It was all a calculated lie. He had harbored that failure and used it as a justification for his ultimate betrayal. And now he had given his mistress the weapon to completely destroy my spirit. Chloe stared at me, waiting for the inevitable collapse. She expected me to burst into hysterical tears. She expected me to scream and slap her across the face. She wanted me to lose my mind in a public country club restroom so she could run back to Richard and tell him his old wife had finally gone completely insane. She wanted to be the victim, but I did not cry. The devastating heartbreak that should have crippled me never arrived. The tears had completely dried up at the cemetery. When a woman is pushed to the absolute edge of her sanity, the pain eventually burns away and leaves behind something far more terrifying. I looked down at her hand resting proudly on her stomach. I looked at the platinum rings shining on her fingers, and then I slowly raised my head and looked directly into her eyes. The mask of the grieving, clueless widow fell away completely. I let her see the freezing, calculated void underneath. I smiled. It was a slow, terrifyingly calm smile that did not reach my eyes. "Congratulations, Chloe," I said, my voice smooth and chillingly flat. "A child is a wonderful blessing. I am sure Richard is absolutely thrilled to start over." Chloe flinched. Her smug smile faltered. She blinked in confusion, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together. She had thrown her most devastating weapon at me, and it had completely bounced off my armor. She did not understand why I was not screaming. She did not understand why I looked so entirely composed. But as I stood there looking at her, my eyes drifted down from her confused face to the base of her throat. Resting against her collarbone, just above the lapel of her white designer suit, was a heavy diamond necklace. It was a stunning piece of vintage jewelry, featuring a thick chain of brilliant cut diamonds, leading down to a massive, distinct teardrop-shaped sapphire, surrounded by a halo of smaller stones. The breath caught sharply in the back of my throat. I knew that necklace. I knew the exact weight of that sapphire. I knew the precise, intricate cut of the platinum setting. It was a custom Cartier piece. My father had commissioned it for my mother on their 20th wedding anniversary. It was one of the most valuable pieces in our family estate, but that was not what made my heart suddenly race with pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Exactly 1 year ago, my father had called the police to his estate. He reported that the wall safe in his private study had been opened, and the Cartier sapphire necklace had been stolen. The police investigated for weeks, but found no signs of forced entry. The insurance company eventually paid out a massive claim for the stolen property. My father had been furious. He always said that only a handful of people knew the combination to that safe. Richard knew the combination. Richard had access to the study. Richard had stolen my dead mother's necklace, reported it as a mystery theft to the insurance company, and then fastened it around the neck of his pregnant mistress. The trap snapped shut in my mind with a loud, echoing clang. Chloe was wearing stolen property. She was wearing a piece of jewelry tied directly to a massive insurance fraud investigation. She was standing in front of me, parading a felony around her neck like a trophy. She had just handed me the exact mechanism I needed to destroy them both without ever touching the trust fund money. "Are you insane?" Chloe stammered, taking a small step backward. The unease was visible in her eyes now. "You just found out your husband is having a baby with me, and you are congratulating me." I reached out and gently, almost affectionately, touched the lapel of her white suit jacket. My fingers brushed dangerously close to the sapphire necklace. She stiffened, but she did not pull away. "I am just being practical, Chloe." I whispered, my voice dropping to a low melodic hum. "You are going to need all the blessings you can get. Raising a child is incredibly expensive, and you have to ensure you provide a stable, legally secure environment for your new family." I stepped back and picked up my small black clutch from the marble counter. I smoothed my navy dress and offered her one final chilling smile. "Enjoy the luncheon, Chloe," I said, turning toward the heavy oak doors. "And do take very good care of that necklace. It is a breathtaking piece. It would be a terrible shame if something were to happen to it." I pushed the door open and walked back out into the bustling dining room, leaving her standing completely alone in the powder room. I did not look back. I walked past the tables of wealthy socialites and out the front doors of the country club. I handed my ticket to the valet and waited for my car. The afternoon sun was bright and blinding. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, shutting out the noise of the world. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed the private direct number for Thomas. The line rang twice before the estate attorney answered. "Sarah," Thomas said, his voice instantly alert. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfectly fine, Thomas," I replied, staring out the windshield at the sprawling green lawns of the golf course. "The idiot widow is officially done crying. I need you to contact the lead investigator for the insurance fraud division at Liberty Mutual. Tell him we have located the Cartier Sapphire, and tell him I have the exact physical address of the woman currently wearing it." I disconnected the call and dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the country club. I was going to let Chloe enjoy her victory lunch. I was going to let Richard dream about his $5 million yacht. Let them celebrate their unborn son and their stolen millions. They had absolutely no idea that the avalanche had already started and it was coming down the mountain to bury them alive. The morning sun filtered through the heavy silk drapes of my suburban home, but it brought absolutely no warmth to the room. I sat alone at the massive marble kitchen island, gripping a ceramic mug of black coffee. I had not slept a single wink. My mind had spent the entire night running through the forensic audit I discovered on my father's hidden flash drive. $4.2 million embezzled over the course of 36 months. A luxury townhouse purchased in the city for a 28-year-old mistress, using a forged second mortgage on the very house I was sitting in. My husband, Richard, was a monster. He was a thief who had masqueraded as a loving partner for 3 decades. But as I was about to learn, a monster rarely operates completely alone. They require enablers. They require accomplices to help them hide their dirty tracks. My laptop screen glowed in the dim light of the kitchen. I had spent the last 48 hours weaving a digital net so tight that not even a single cent could slip through without triggering an alarm. By intercepting Brenda's cloud data, I had mapped out every hidden account, every shell company, and every fake routing number Richard and Chloe had established. But Richard was not a patient man. Greed makes people stupid, and desperation makes them incredibly sloppy. He knew my father had completely cut him out of the primary estate. He knew his grand plan to use the blind trust for his new consulting venture was dead. He also knew he had promised his young pregnant mistress a life of absolute luxury that he could no longer afford. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately to cover the closing costs on Chloe's new townhouse and to maintain his illusion of power. I was sipping a cup of black coffee when my phone vibrated against the marble counter. It was not a text message or a social media update. It was a high-priority push notification from the primary marital investment account we held at the most prestigious downtown bank in Chicago. I set my coffee mug down. My fingers did not tremble as I picked up the device. I opened the secure banking application and stared at the pending transaction log. A wire transfer request had just been initiated. The amount was exactly $2 million. It was the entire liquid balance of our joint mutual fund. The destination account was a routing number I recognized immediately from my forensic audit. It was the offshore shell entity in the Cayman Islands. He was trying to drain our life savings right out from under me. Richard thought I was still sitting at home, weeping over my father's grave. He thought I was too paralyzed by grief to monitor our financial portfolios. He assumed the joint account was easy prey because it required dual signatures for massive withdrawals, but he planned to manipulate the bank manager just as he had manipulated me for 30 years. He was orchestrating a final desperate cash grab before the reality of his disinheritance became public knowledge. But he did not know that Thomas, my father's fiercely loyal estate attorney, had spent the entire night working with a federal judge. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Inside was a certified copy of my father's death certificate. Behind it lay the updated trust documents proving my unilateral control over the estate. And at the very back, printed on heavy watermarked paper, was a newly minted emergency court injunction. The injunction explicitly froze all of Richard's personal and joint assets pending a federal investigation into massive corporate embezzlement and mortgage fraud. It was a financial death warrant signed by a judge. I placed the documents back into my briefcase. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. I felt only the sharp, cold thrill of an apex predator closing in on its prey. I walked out to my car and slid into the driver's seat. The drive to the downtown financial district took exactly 22 minutes. The city rushed past my windows in a blur of gray concrete and steel, but my focus remained absolute. I visualized the layout of the bank. I knew exactly where the branch manager's office was located. For 3 decades, I had played the silent, supportive wife standing behind Richard at corporate galas and bank dinners, smiling politely while he took all the credit. I had ironed his shirts, managed his schedule, and polished his public image to absolute perfection. I had built the armor he wore to the world. Now I was going to systematically strip it away in the middle of a crowded bank lobby. I pulled into the underground parking garage and handed my keys to the attendant. I took the private elevator up to the main banking floor. The door slid open to reveal a massive, cavernous space filled with polished marble floors, gleaming brass fixtures, and the hushed, respectful murmurs of high-net-worth banking. The scent of old money and expensive leather hung heavy in the air. I walked past the row of tellers, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone floor. I did not look like a broken widow. I walked with the perfectly straight posture of a senior trust officer who owned the entire building. At the far end of the lobby was a row of private glass-walled offices reserved for premium clients. I slowed my pace slightly, my eyes scanning the transparent panels. In the third office down, I saw him. Richard was sitting in a plush leather guest chair, leaning heavily over a large mahogany desk. His bespoke suit jacket was unbuttoned, and his tie was slightly loosened. He was sweating. He was frantically gesturing with his hands, speaking in an aggressive, rapid-fire tone to the branch manager, Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison sat behind the desk, looking incredibly uncomfortable, staring at a computer screen. Richard had a gold fountain pen gripped tightly in his right hand. He was pushing the manager to bypass the dual signature protocol and push the wire transfer through immediately on his sole authority. He was minutes away from stealing $2 million. I did not knock. I simply grabbed the heavy brass handle of the office door and pushed it open. The heavy glass door swung inward, hitting the doorstop with a loud, sharp crack that echoed over the quiet hum of the lobby. Richard violently flinched. His head snapped around and his eyes went incredibly wide. The color drained entirely from his face in a single second, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. The gold fountain pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the polished desk. "Sarah." Richard choked out, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at home resting." I ignored him completely. I walked straight past his chair, bringing with me an aura of absolute freezing authority. I stopped directly in front of Mr. Harrison's desk. The bank manager stood up quickly, adjusting his glasses, looking completely bewildered by my sudden aggressive entrance. "Mrs. Miller." Mr. Harrison stammered. "We were not expecting you." "Mr. Miller informed me you were indisposed due to your tragic loss. Please accept my deepest condolences for your father." I placed my leather briefcase on the desk and unclasped the lock. "Thank you for your condolences, Mr. Harrison." I replied, my voice perfectly even and chillingly calm, but I am afraid my husband has grossly misrepresented my condition. Furthermore, he is attempting to execute an unauthorized transaction that violates federal law. Richard leaped out of his chair. His face shifted from pale shock to a dark mottled red. He reached out to grab my arm, playing his usual card of physical intimidation. "Sarah, you are acting hysterical." He hissed, his voice dripping with venomous fake concern. The grief is making you delusional. You need to step outside right now before you embarrass yourself. Mr. Harrison, I apologize. My wife is suffering a severe mental breakdown. Please just authorize the wire and I will take her home. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I turned my head slowly and locked eyes with the man who had secretly leveraged my home to buy a love nest for his mistress. Do not ever touch me again, Richard. I whispered the words, slicing through the air like a scalpel. And do not ever mistake my clarity for hysteria. I turned back to the bank manager, who was now staring at us with wide, terrified eyes. Several bank employees and wealthy clients in the main lobby had stopped what they were doing and were peering through the glass walls watching the drama unfold. Richard's carefully crafted public image was beginning to crack under the bright fluorescent lights. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. I slammed them down onto the mahogany desk. The sharp slap of the paper made Richard physically jump. Mr. Harrison, I stated loudly, projecting my voice so every single word carried absolute weight. The man sitting in your office is currently under active investigation for massive corporate embezzlement and mortgage fraud. The $2 million he is attempting to wire to a Cayman Islands shell company are stolen marital funds. I placed the certified death certificate on top of the pile. My father passed away last week. Prior to his death, he restructured his entire estate into a blind trust under my sole control, completely disinheriting Richard. I slid the trust documents forward. And finally, I placed the most devastating piece of paper right in front of the manager's keyboard. This is an emergency court injunction signed at 8 o'clock this morning by a federal judge. It orders the immediate freezing of all personal joint and corporate accounts associated with Richard Miller. If you process that wire transfer, you will be actively facilitating international money laundering, and your bank will face immediate federal prosecution. Mr. Harrison stared at the injunction. The official crimson seal of the court glared back at him. He swallowed hard, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. His hands shook as he quickly moved his mouse across the screen. Transaction canceled. Mr. Harrison announced, his voice incredibly thin. The funds are locked. Mr. Miller, your accounts are officially frozen per the court order. I cannot authorize any withdrawals, transfers, or credit advances. I must ask you to step away from my desk. The words hit Richard like a physical strike to the knees. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the leather guest chair. The $2 million, his golden parachute, his last desperate hope of maintaining his lavish lifestyle and his demanding mistress had just evaporated into thin air. He was trapped. He looked out through the glass walls. Dozens of people were watching him. Bank tellers, security guards, and high society clients who knew him by name were whispering and pointing. The respected, successful regional corporate director had just been exposed as a common desperate thief in the middle of his own bank. The absolute public humiliation washed over him, destroying his massive ego piece by piece. Richard spun around to face me. The mask of the charming, successful businessman completely shattered. His eyes were wide and feral, burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. He took a threatening step toward me, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. You bitch! He snarled, his voice a raw, guttural sound. You think you can destroy me? I built that company. I earned that money. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years. I will hire the best legal team in this city, and I will bleed you completely dry. You are nothing without me, Sarah. Nothing. I looked at the furious, pathetic man standing before me. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the profound satisfaction of a perfectly executed audit. I slowly picked up my briefcase and snapped the lock shut. You are not going to hire anyone, Richard. I replied, my voice echoing with pure icy power. Lawyers require retainers. Lawyers require liquid cash. And as of 5 minutes ago, you do not have a single penny to your name. Your credit cards are frozen. Your checking accounts are locked. You have zero equity in our home because you fraudulently leveraged it to buy a townhouse for a 28-year-old girl. A transaction the FBI is currently investigating. I stepped closer to him, invading his space, forcing him to look down at the woman he had underestimated for 30 years. You are standing in a $4,000 bespoke suit that you can no longer afford to dry clean. I whispered, leaning in so only he could hear the final devastating truth. You are penniless. You are powerless. And your little mistress is going to leave you the absolute second she realizes the money is gone. I did not wait for his response. I did not give him the satisfaction of another word. I turned my back on him and walked out of the manager's office. The heavy glass door swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of his ragged breathing. I strode across the marble floor of the bank lobby, my head held high, my posture unbroken. The crowd parted for me, parting like the Red Sea out of sheer awe and respect. I walked out through the revolving glass doors and stepped back into the bright morning sunlight. The air tasted incredibly sweet. The cage was locked and I had thrown away the key. I returned to the sprawling suburban house that was now exclusively mine. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, echoing with a satisfying finality. I walked into the grand foyer and immediately heard the chaotic sounds of destruction coming from the master suite upstairs. Drawers were being slammed shut with violent force. Hangers scraped loudly against the metal closet rods. A heavy leather suitcase hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. Richard had beaten me home. I slowly climbed the sweeping mahogany staircase, my hand trailing lightly over the polished banister. I felt no fear. The woman who would have once trembled at his anger was dead and buried. I stepped into the doorway of our bedroom and watched the pathetic spectacle unfolding before me. Richard was tearing through his massive walk-in closet like a panicked animal. He was throwing expensive Italian silk ties, custom-tailored dress shirts, and Italian leather shoes into his monogrammed travel bags. His face was flushed a deep mottled crimson, and his chest heaved with ragged breaths. The bespoke suit he had worn to the bank was now hopelessly wrinkled, his tie discarded somewhere on the floor. When he saw me standing in the doorway, his eyes narrowed into furious slits. "You think you have won, Sarah?" He spat the words out, his voice dripping with venomous arrogance. "You think freezing my accounts and embarrassing me in front of a bank manager changes anything? You are just a bitter, aging woman throwing a temper tantrum because I finally found someone who makes me feel alive." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest. I watched him shove a handful of expensive watches into a velvet travel case. He was desperately clinging to the illusion of control. "I am leaving you, Sarah," he shouted, throwing a pair of silver cufflinks across the room. They bounced off the antique vanity mirror with a sharp clatter. "I am going to Chloe. She loves me for who I am, not for the money your father dangled over my head for 30 years. I am moving into the townhouse and we are going to start a real family, a family you were too broken to give me." He thought those words would shatter me. He thought weaponizing my past fertility struggles would bring me to my knees weeping and begging him to stay. He wanted the satisfaction of my absolute devastation. Instead, I offered him a slow, chilling smile. "Pack lightly, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any emotion. "Chloe has limited closet space." He zipped his leather duffel bag with a violent jerk and marched toward me, stopping just inches from my face. He tried to use his height to intimidate me, but I did not break eye contact. "Listen to me very carefully, you pathetic excuse for a wife." He hissed his hot breath, smelling of stale coffee and pure panic. "You might control the blind trust right now, but you cannot touch the marital assets. I gave 30 years of my life to this marriage. I built that regional division from the ground up. I am going to hire the most ruthless divorce attorney in Chicago. I will drag you through court for years. I will force the sale of this house, and I will take exactly half of everything we own. You will be writing me a massive alimony check every single month for the rest of your miserable life." He picked up his heavy bags and shoved his way past me, intentionally bumping his shoulder against mine. He marched down the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing loudly through the empty house. He shouted over his shoulder that I would be hearing from his lawyers by the end of the week. The heavy front door slammed shut, shaking the glass panes in the entryway. A few moments later, the aggressive roar of his sports car engine echoed down the driveway, fading into the distance. I stood alone in the master bedroom, surrounded by the discarded hangers and empty velvet boxes. He genuinely believed he was going to take me to divorce court and walk away with a fortune. He believed he was simply navigating a messy breakup. He had absolutely no idea that he was not facing a divorce settlement. He was facing a federal criminal indictment. I walked over to the vanity, picked up the silver cufflinks he had thrown in his tantrum, and dropped them into the trash can. I had a meeting to prepare for, and I needed a clear head. The next morning, the city of Chicago was bathed in a brilliant, crisp sunlight. I dressed in a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, my armor for the day. I drove downtown to the prestigious law firm of my father's estate attorney. The offices of Thomas and Associates occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper overlooking the dark blue waters of Lake Michigan. The receptionist offered me a polite, respectful nod and immediately ushered me into the massive corner office. Thomas was already sitting behind his polished walnut desk. A silver tray with fresh coffee and porcelain cups rested on the low glass table in the center of the room. He looked up as I entered, his sharp eyes assessing my calm demeanor. He gestured for me to sit in the plush leather chair opposite his desk. "You look remarkably composed, Sarah," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands together. "I heard about the little scene at the bank yesterday. Word travels incredibly fast in the financial district. Richard attempted to wire the mutual fund balance to a Cayman Islands routing number." I nodded slowly, placing my leather briefcase on the floor beside my chair. "He panicked just as I expected, Thomas. I intercepted the transfer using the emergency injunction you secured. But yesterday afternoon, he packed his bags and moved into the townhouse with Chloe. He screamed that he is going to hire a ruthless attorney, force the sale of the marital home, and take half of our assets in divorce court. He believes he is entitled to millions." Thomas let out a low, rumbling chuckle. The sound was entirely devoid of humor. It was the sound of a seasoned predator watching a mouse walk willingly into a trap. He picked up his reading glasses and slid them onto his face. "Richard is an exceptionally arrogant man, Sarah." Thomas said, his voice dropping to a serious, methodical tone, but his arrogance has made him entirely blind to the reality of his situation. He assumes your father was simply a stubborn old man who changed his will out of spite. He assumes the embezzlement of the corporate funds was a perfect, untraceable crime. He is operating under the delusion that he successfully outsmarted William. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool surface of the walnut desk. "My father left me a flash drive, Thomas. I spent the entire night reviewing the forensic audit. Richard embezzled $4.2 million over 3 years. He funneled the money through a shell company in the Cayman Islands called Apex Global Solutions and then routed it to a private wealth management account in Zurich. He also forged my signature on a second mortgage to purchase a luxury townhouse for his 28-year-old mistress in cash. He used his sister Brenda as a proxy to help launder the funds. I have the entire digital paper trail secured. I am ready to hand it over to the federal authorities and send him to prison." Thomas looked at me with a profound sense of pride shining in his eyes. He opened the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a thick red legal folder. He placed it deliberately in the center of the desk, directly between us. "Your father knew you would find the trail, Sarah," Thomas said softly. "William was a master of logistics. He noticed the accounting discrepancies in the regional division over 8 months ago. He hired the private investigators to trace the Cayman accounts. He knew exactly what Richard was doing. He knew about the mistress. He knew about the forged mortgage. He knew about his sister's complicity." My breath caught sharply in my throat. My father knew for 8 months. I stared at the red folder, feeling a sudden wave of confusion. If he knew Richard was stealing millions, why did he not fire him immediately? Why did he not call the police and have him arrested for corporate fraud and embezzlement while he was still alive? Why did he allow Richard to keep coming to Sunday dinners and playing the role of the devoted son-in-law? Thomas reached out and rested his hand on the red folder. Because William did not just want to fire Richard. He wanted to entirely dismantle his existence. He knew that if he fired him, Richard would hire high-priced defense attorneys, tie the company up in litigation, and potentially hide the remaining stolen assets in offshore trusts where we could never reach them. William wanted to ensure that Richard walked away with absolutely nothing, and he wanted to give you the ultimate power to execute the final blow. Thomas opened the red folder and turned the document toward me. It was a dense, complex legal contract filled with financial jargon and corporate seals. Instead of reporting the embezzlement to the authorities, William quietly utilized his absolute executive authority over the holding company. Thomas explained, tapping a specific clause with his gold pen. He ordered the internal accounting department to legally reclassify every single unauthorized transfer made by Richard over the last 36 months. He did not classify them as stolen funds. He classified them as callable corporate loans. I stared at the document, my mind racing to process the sheer brilliant magnitude of my father's strategy. Callable corporate loans. Exactly. Thomas smiled a sharp, dangerous smile. By legally defining the stolen $4.2 million as personal corporate loans issued directly to Richard, my father completely bypassed the need for an immediate criminal investigation. These loans were secretly secured against Richard's personal freedom, his marital assets, and his future earnings. The contract stipulates that the loans carry an exorbitant compounding interest rate and are callable at the absolute discretion of the primary trust executor, which is me. I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a freight train. Which is you, Thomas confirmed, leaning back in his chair. As the sole executor of the blind trust, you now hold the debt. Richard does not owe the company money. He owes you money. The contract includes a strict confession of judgment clause. Because he signed the vendor authorizations to route the money to the Cayman Islands, the law views his digital signatures as acceptance of these loan terms. If the loans are called in, and he cannot immediately produce the $4.2 million plus interest, he is instantly in default. I felt a chilling thrill wash over my entire body. My father was a genius. He had built an inescapable financial prison right under Richard's nose. Richard thought he was cleverly stealing untraceable cash. In reality, he had been quietly accepting legally binding corporate debt that was slowly tightening around his neck like a steel noose. If he tries to take me to divorce court, I began, my voice perfectly calm and steady. If he tries to take you to divorce court. Thomas interrupted, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. He will quickly discover that his share of the marital assets is completely wiped out by the corporate debt he owes the trust. The court will order the liquidation of his pension, his stock options, and his remaining bank accounts to satisfy the callable loans. Furthermore, the confession of judgment allows us to completely bypass a lengthy civil trial. We can immediately seize everything he owns. He screamed about taking half the estate. He will be lucky if he can afford a bus ticket out of the city. I looked down at the complex legal documents detailing the callable corporate loans. The brilliance of the trap was breathtaking. But as my eyes scanned the clauses detailing the recovery of the dispersed funds, a new terrifyingly beautiful realization began to form in my mind. The puzzle pieces connected with absolute freezing clarity. Thomas, I said, looking up from the red folder. The liquid funds Richard moved to the Zurich account. He did not keep all of them there. He brought almost $3 million back into the country to purchase a luxury downtown townhouse outright in cash. He put the deed entirely in Chloe's name, and his sister Brenda recently purchased a lavish vacation home in Florida. She claimed it was a stock investment, but I intercepted her cloud data. She received regular, massive wire transfers from the Cayman Shell Company as payment for acting as his proxy. Thomas stopped spinning his gold pen. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the desk. His sharp eyes locked onto mine, processing the financial implications of my discovery. Are you absolutely certain the townhouse and the Florida property were purchased using the funds routed through the Cayman accounts? Thomas asked, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. I am certain, I replied, tapping my leather briefcase. I have the exact routing numbers, the wire transfer receipts, and the digital communications proving the origin of the capital. They used the embezzled corporate money to buy those properties. A slow, predatory smile spread across Thomas's face, the kind of smile that meant absolute, total destruction for anyone standing on the opposing side of the law. Sarah, Thomas whispered, leaning closer, because William legally reclassified those embezzled funds as callable corporate loans, the money never belonged to Richard. It always belonged to the holding company. Therefore, Any assets purchased with those specific funds are legally considered the direct proceeds of corporate debt. I felt a cold shiver of pure absolute power run down my spine. I looked at Thomas, my mind perfectly aligned with his legal strategy. "So Chloe does not own that townhouse," I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet office. "No," Thomas confirmed. "Chloe is simply residing in a property purchased with stolen corporate funds, and Brenda's vacation home is a physical asset acquired through proxy money laundering. Because they knowingly accepted the money and the properties, they are no longer just mistresses and enablers. They are legally classified as recipients of stolen corporate funds." The air in the room felt incredibly thin. Richard thought he was moving into a safe luxury haven with his pregnant mistress. He thought his sister had successfully helped him secure a secret offshore fortune. He thought he was untouchable. He had no idea that my father had turned his stolen millions into radioactive debt. "They are all tied to the loans," I whispered, staring at the red folder. "Every single one of them," Thomas agreed softly. "Richard, Chloe, and Brenda. They are all standing on a financial landmine." "And you?" "Sarah, hold the detonator. You can call in the loans at any time. When you do, the federal authorities will not just seize the bank accounts. They will seize the townhouse. They will seize the vacation home. They will strip those women of every single asset they acquired using your father's money." I sat back in the plush leather chair. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The trap was perfectly primed. The cage was locked. The idiot widow was gone forever. It was time to push the button and watch their arrogant little worlds burn completely to ash. The grand ballroom of the prestigious downtown Waldorf Astoria Hotel was a blinding sea of glittering crystal chandeliers and suffocating corporate arrogance. Tonight was the annual Vanguard Industry Excellence Gala. It was the most important night of the year for the logistics and shipping tycoons of Chicago. For decades, my father had attended this very event as a titan of the industry, commanding the respect of every executive in the room. I had always stood quietly by his side, or a few steps behind my husband, playing the role of the perfectly supportive, polite, and invisible wife. I had spent 30 years blending into the background, making sure Richard looked like the brilliant visionary he so desperately wanted to be. But tonight, the dynamics of power had permanently shifted. Richard believed he had already won the war. He was completely ignorant of the devastating legal trap my father had set for him. He was completely unaware that the millions of dollars he had embezzled through his sister Brenda had been legally reclassified as callable corporate loans secured against his own personal freedom. He did not know that his offshore Cayman accounts were being monitored, or that his frantic attempt to wire the remaining $2 million from our joint account had been blocked by a federal judge. In his deeply narcissistic mind, he was still a wealthy, untouchable executive who had successfully discarded his aging wife for a younger model. He had attended the gala tonight with two very specific goals. He intended to publicly debut his 28-year-old mistress, Chloe, to high society, and he planned to use the event to network with aggressive venture capitalists to secure a lucrative buyout for his regional division. He actually thought he could use the money he stole from my family to purchase his own empire. I stood in the opulent marble foyer of my empty suburban home and looked at my reflection in the gilded antique mirror. The grieving, helpless widow who had wept at the cemetery was gone. She had been completely burned away by the searing reality of his betrayal. Tonight, I was shedding the heavy black garments of mourning. I stepped into a perfectly tailored, crisp, white designer pantsuit. The fabric was heavy and immaculate, clinging to my frame like a suit of modern armor. I chose white deliberately. It was a stark, blinding contrast to the dark shadows Richard had tried to force me into. It was a statement of absolute, undeniable power. I wore no extravagant jewelry. I wore no stolen diamonds. The only accessory I clasped around my wrist was my late father's vintage gold watch. It felt heavy and cold against my skin, serving as a constant grounding reminder of the mission I was about to execute. I drove myself to the city. The dark highways blurred past my windows, but my mind was completely still. I did not feel a single drop of anxiety. I felt the terrifyingly calm precision of an auditor who had already tallied the final devastating numbers. The math was entirely on my side. I pulled up to the grand entrance of the hotel and stepped out of my car. The cool evening wind caught the edges of my white jacket as I handed the keys to the valet. I walked up the wide, red-carpeted steps and pushed through the heavy, brass revolving doors. The symphony of the gala hit me instantly. The sweeping melodies of a live string quartet floated over the loud, buzzing chatter of 500 wealthy guests. Waiters in crisp black tuxedos moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne flutes and delicate appetizers. The room smelled of expensive aged wine, heavy floral centerpieces, and the unmistakable scent of desperate ambition. I paused at the top of the grand staircase overlooking the massive ballroom. I took a slow, deep breath and began my descent. My white suit caught the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers, standing out like a beacon against a sea of dark formal wear. It took exactly 10 seconds for the room to notice my arrival. The loud, animated conversations near the staircase abruptly faltered. The silence rippled outward, moving through the crowd like a heavy wave. Heads turned. Glasses were slowly lowered. The elite members of Chicago high society stared at me in absolute shock. Everyone in that room knew my father had died just last week. They all knew Richard was here tonight, parading a young blonde woman around the room. They had assumed the devastated widow was hiding at home, broken and humiliated. But here I was walking straight into the lion's den, radiating a cold, untouchable authority. I kept my chin perfectly level and my gaze fixed straight ahead. I did not offer polite smiles. I did not nod at the people staring at me. I walked through the parted crowd like a ghost seeking absolute vengeance. It did not take me long to find my targets. Richard and Chloe were standing near a massive glittering ice sculpture, holding court with a circle of powerful venture capitalists. Richard was wearing a custom midnight blue tuxedo, looking every bit the triumphant conqueror. He was holding a glass of bourbon, gesturing animatedly as he pitched his brilliant new business strategies, the strategies I had written for him. Chloe stood glued to his side, wearing a scandalously low-cut silver evening gown that clung tightly to her body. She had one manicured hand resting possessively on Richard's arm and the other resting gently on her stomach, playing the role of the glowing, expecting mother. She was smiling brightly, completely oblivious to the felony insurance fraud she had committed by wearing my stolen Cartier sapphire necklace just 2 days prior. I stopped about 20 feet away from their circle and simply stood there watching them. I waited for the exact moment the atmosphere shifted. One of the older venture capitalists, a man who had done business with my father for 20 years, suddenly stopped smiling. He looked past Richard's shoulder and his eyes went wide. He cleared his throat nervously and took a slow step backward, distancing himself from my husband. Richard frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption to his grand pitch. He turned his head to see what had distracted his audience. When his eyes landed on me, the color instantly drained from his face. His confident, arrogant smile vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He nearly dropped his glass of bourbon. Chloe followed his gaze and physically flinched, taking a quick step behind Richard, as if attempting to use him as a human shield. Richard quickly whispered something to the investors, offering a strained fake apology before marching directly toward me. His face was flushed, a dark, mottled red. The veins in his neck were bulging against his stiff white collar. He closed the distance between us and grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug into my flesh with brutal, unforgiving force, just as they had at the cemetery. Yeah. He tried to pull me toward a secluded hallway, away from the staring eyes of the corporate elite. "What the hell are you doing here, Sarah?" Richard hissed, his voice a venomous, trembling whisper. "You are making an absolute fool of yourself. You are completely unhinged. You need to leave this building right now before I have you physically thrown out." I did not pull my arm away. I did not raise my voice. I looked down at his hand gripping my white sleeve, and then I looked directly into his panicked, terrified eyes. "Take your hand off me, Richard," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, freezing register that carried more threat than a scream ever could. "I am here to protect my investments." Richard let out a harsh, desperate laugh. Your investments. You are out of your mind. I am securing the capital for my new firm tonight. I am taking the regional division, and there is nothing you or your dead father's lawyers can do to stop me. I tried to do this quietly, but you leave me no choice. He raised his free hand and snapped his fingers sharply, signaling to the head of hotel security who was monitoring the floor. A large, imposing man in a dark suit quickly jogged over to us, looking stern and ready to intervene. "Officer?" Richard said loudly, projecting his voice so the nearby guests could hear his fabricated narrative. "My wife is suffering from a severe manic episode due to her recent grief. She is trespassing on a private corporate event and causing a massive disturbance. I need you to escort her to a taxi immediately. She is not well." The security guard nodded sympathetically and reached out his hand toward my shoulder. "Ma'am, I am going to have to ask you to come with me," he said in a firm, professional tone. I smoothly stepped back, evading the guard's reach. I stood perfectly straight, adjusting the cuffs of my white jacket. I looked the security guard directly in the eyes. "I strongly advise you to check the registry of the Vanguard Industry Excellence Gala before you touch me," I stated, my voice echoing with pure, unshakable authority. The corporate account funding this entire evening, including the catering, the ballroom rental, and your personal security wages, is held by the William Estate Blind Trust. I am the sole executive director of that trust. If you attempt to remove me from a building I am currently paying for, you will be standing in the unemployment line by tomorrow morning. The security guard froze completely. His hand dropped back to his side. He looked at Richard, whose face had gone completely pale, and then back at me. The absolute certainty in my voice left no room for doubt. The guard took 2 slow steps backward, lowered his head respectfully, and quickly retreated into the crowd, leaving Richard entirely defenseless. Richard stared at me, his jaw clenching in impotent fury. "You think a parlor trick with a security guard makes you powerful, Sarah?" he whispered, taking a step closer. "You are just delaying the inevitable. I am going to ruin you in court. I am going to take half of everything your father built." Before I could answer, the loud, sharp chime of a crystal glass being tapped echoed through the massive speakers of the ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing. The room fell into a hushed, expectant silence. On the grand stage at the front of the room, the master of ceremonies stepped up to the polished glass podium. The bright theatrical spotlights illuminated the stage, casting long, dramatic shadows across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer spoke, his voice booming through the silent ballroom. "It is my great honor tonight to present the Vanguard Industry Award for Regional Leadership. This award recognizes the executive who has shown unparalleled vision, aggressive growth, and steadfast loyalty to the logistics sector over the past decade." Richard's chest puffed out. The panic in his eyes was instantly replaced by a blinding, greedy pride. He had campaigned for this award for years. He desperately needed this public validation to secure the buyout from the venture capitalists. He thought this moment would cement his legacy and completely overshadow my presence. He leaned in close to my ear, his hot breath making my skin crawl. "Watch me win, Sarah," he whispered, a sickeningly triumphant sneer on his lips. "Watch me take everything." Richard turned away from me, abandoning his mistress in the crowd. He buttoned his suit jacket and began a slow, confident march down the center aisle of the ballroom, heading directly toward the brightly lit stage. The audience began a polite, scattered applause, anticipating the announcement. I did not watch him walk. I did not stand in the shadows and accept my defeat. I turned sharply and walked down the side aisle, moving parallel to him. My white suit cut through the dark room like a flash of lightning. I moved with purposeful, unrelenting speed. The heavy fabric of my jacket swung perfectly with every stride. The crowd parted for me, their eyes wide with shock and confusion as they watched the widow race the executive to the front of the room. "And the Vanguard Award goes to the Regional Corporate Director of the Year," the announcer called out, opening the golden envelope. "Mr. Richard Miller." The ballroom erupted into applause. Richard smiled brilliantly, raising his hand to acknowledge the crowd as he approached the front row of tables. He stepped onto the bottom stair of the center stage, basking in the blinding glory of the spotlights. He thought he had reached the absolute pinnacle of his career. he was wrong. I reached the side stairs of the stage a fraction of a second before he did. I did not hesitate. I climbed the steps with smooth, terrifying grace. I walked straight across the polished wooden floor of the stage, moving directly into the harsh glare of the center spotlight. The announcer looked at me, his eyes widening in total confusion. He held the heavy crystal trophy in one hand and the microphone in the other. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask me what I was doing, but I did not give him the chance. I reached out with a steady, unwavering hand and took the microphone directly from his grasp. The loud hum of audio feedback shrieked through the speakers. The applause in the ballroom died instantly. Hundreds of guests gasped in collective shock. Richard froze on the top step of the stage, his brilliant smile sliding off his face like wet clay. He stared at me standing behind the podium, holding the microphone, wearing a pristine white suit. Bathed in the light he thought belonged exclusively to him. I looked down at my husband. He was completely trapped in the open, vulnerable, and entirely powerless to stop what was coming next. I looked out at the sea of wealthy executives, the venture capitalists, and the Mistress hiding in the back. I gripped the microphone tightly, feeling the cold metal against my palm. The time for silent sacrifices was over. The trap was sprung, and I was ready to deliver the fatal blow. The sharp screech of audio feedback pierced the grand ballroom, slicing through the suffocating silence. 300 of the most powerful executives, venture capitalists, and board members in Chicago stared at me in absolute shock. I stood behind the polished glass podium, gripping the microphone with a perfectly steady hand. The blinding theatrical spotlights washed over my pristine white pantsuit. I looked down at Richard. He was frozen on the top step of the stage, his midnight blue tuxedo suddenly looking like a cheap costume. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The arrogant, triumphant conqueror had vanished, replaced by a terrified little boy who had just been caught in a massive lie. "Good evening, everyone." I spoke into the microphone, my voice echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings with a chilling, absolute calm. My name is Sarah Miller. As the sole executive director of the William Estate Blind Trust, I am the primary financial sponsor of tonight's gala. I know many of you were expecting to hear a grand visionary speech from the regional corporate director. You were expecting to hear about aggressive growth and brilliant new business strategies. But tonight we are going to talk about something entirely different. Tonight we are going to talk about the truth. I reached into the pocket of my white jacket and pulled out a small black remote control. Thomas, my father's fiercely loyal estate attorney, was stationed in the audiovisual control booth at the back of the room. I gave him a single subtle nod and pressed the button. Behind me, the massive digital projection screen that was supposed to display the corporate logo suddenly flickered to life. The bright blue light illuminated the stage, casting a harsh glow over Richard's pale face. A massive, beautifully formatted spreadsheet appeared on the screen. It was 50 feet wide and completely undeniable. The bold black numbers glowed for the entire ballroom to see. Let us begin with a lesson in forensic accounting. I announced, my voice ringing with total authority. For the past 36 months, the man standing on this stage has presented himself as a pillar of corporate integrity. He has shaken your hands at dinner parties and asked for your investment capital. What he did not tell you is that he has been quietly, systematically robbing my father's holding company blind. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Board members sat up straight in their chairs. The wealthy venture capitalists who had just been laughing with Richard suddenly looked at him with sheer, absolute disgust. I pressed the button on my remote again. The screen transitioned to a highly detailed flowchart. It traced the origin of corporate funds from the regional division directly to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. This is Apex Global Solutions. I explained, pacing slowly across the stage. A ghost company registered to a proxy agent. It has no office, no employees, and no product. Yet over the last 3 years, Richard authorized the transfer of $4.2 million of corporate funds into this dummy account. Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He lunged forward toward the podium, his face twisted into a mask of feral panic. "Turn that off!" He screamed, his voice cracking wildly. This is a lie. She is a hysterical, grieving widow making up insane stories. Turn off the screen right now." He reached for the microphone, but he never made it. Two massive security guards, the very same guards who now understood exactly who signed their paychecks, stepped out from the shadows of the stage wings. They grabbed Richard by the shoulders of his expensive tuxedo and physically forced him back down the stairs. He struggled wildly, kicking and shouting, but they held him firmly in place at the base of the stage, forcing him to look up at me. I did not even flinch. I looked at the venture capitalists sitting in the front row, the men Richard had desperately tried to impress tonight. As you can see on the screen, gentlemen. I continued perfectly composed. The money did not stay in the Cayman Islands. It was routed directly into a private wealth management account in Zurich. And from there, nearly $3 million was brought back into the United States to purchase a luxury downtown townhouse entirely in cash. I clicked the remote. A high-resolution photograph of the property deed appeared on the 50-foot screen. I highlighted the name of the registered owner in bright yellow. "The deed is not in Richard's name," I stated, projecting my voice to the very back of the massive room. "The deed is registered to a 28-year-old woman named Chloe." I paused, letting the name hang in the heavy, suffocating air. I looked out into the crowd, scanning the sea of horrified faces, until I found her. Chloe was standing near the ice sculpture, exactly where Richard had left her. The smug, arrogant pride she had displayed at the country club powder room was completely gone. She was shrinking back into the shadows, her face the color of chalk. The other guests near her physically stepped away, parting like the Red Sea to leave her entirely exposed. "Yes, that is right," I said, pointing directly at her. The young blonde woman trying to hide by the bar in the silver evening gown. "That is the woman my husband has been financing with stolen corporate capital. But the embezzlement is only the first chapter of this tragic little story." I pressed the button again. The screen shifted to display a highly magnified image of a loan origination file. "You see, Richard is not just a thief," I declared. "He is also a remarkably sloppy forger." In order to purchase that luxury townhouse for his mistress, he needed upfront capital. He could not drain the offshore accounts entirely without triggering federal alarms, so he took out a secret second mortgage on our marital home. A home that is fully paid off and held jointly in my name. I pointed to the digital signature on the screen. He forged my signature on the loan documents. He falsified the notarization. He legally encumbered the roof over my head to buy a love nest for a girl half his age. That is felony mortgage fraud. The murmurs in the ballroom exploded into loud, chaotic chatter. My father's oldest friends and business partners were staring at Richard with pure venom. Richard was shaking violently in the grip of the security guards. Tears of sheer panic and humiliation were streaming down his face. He looked at the massive screen, and then he looked at me, his eyes begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. "Sarah, please," Richard begged, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please stop this. We can talk about this in private. I will give it all back. Just turn off the screen." I ignored his pathetic whining completely. I turned my attention back to the crowd, specifically locking eyes with Chloe. She was trembling visibly, her hands clutching her small silver purse. I would like everyone to direct their attention back to the lovely Chloe. I announced, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch that forced the entire room to fall dead silent to hear me. "Look very closely at the beautiful vintage diamond and sapphire necklace she is wearing tonight. It is a stunning custom Cartier piece, is it not?" Hundreds of heads swiveled to stare at Chloe. The bright ballroom lights caught the massive teardrop sapphire resting against her collarbone. She instinctively reached up and covered the necklace with her hand, her eyes darting frantically around the room looking for an exit. "Exactly 1 year ago," I continued, my voice echoing with icy precision. "My father reported that exact necklace stolen from his private wall safe. The police investigated for weeks. The insurance company paid out a massive claim for the loss. My husband stole my dead mother's jewelry, committed insurance fraud, and wrapped it around the neck of his pregnant mistress." A loud collective gasp erupted from the high society crowd. Women covered their mouths in absolute horror. The venture capitalists shook their heads in utter disgust. Chloe let out a sharp, terrified sob. She tried to unhook the clasp of the necklace with shaking fingers, desperate to get the stolen felony off her body, but the intricate platinum lock was entirely too complicated for her panicked hands. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen behind me changed to display a dense, complex, legal document bearing the official seal of the holding company. "You thought you were so incredibly smart, Richard," I said, looking down at the broken man kneeling at the base of the stage. "You thought you could take my money, buy your freedom, and leave me with nothing but a broken heart. But you forgot that my father was a master of logistics. He knew exactly what you were doing months ago. He did not fire you. He did not report you to the police while he was alive. Instead, he used his absolute executive authority to legally reclassify every single dollar you embezzled as a callable corporate loan." Richard stopped struggling against the guards. He stared up at me, his jaw dropping open in total disbelief. The realization of what I was saying began to slowly process in his mind. Those loans were secured against your personal freedom and your future earnings. I explained the satisfaction radiating through every word. "And because you signed the digital authorizations to route the money offshore, the law views your signatures as full legal acceptance of those loan terms. As the sole executor of the blind trust, I am officially calling in those loans, effective immediately." Richard let out a loud, gut-wrenching scream. He dropped to his knees, pulling against the security guards, his legs no longer able to support his own weight. He knew exactly what that meant. It meant he owed the trust over $4 million instantly. It meant every single asset he possessed was subject to immediate seizure. And because the townhouse and the offshore accounts were funded directly by those specific corporate loans, I continued turning my gaze toward Chloe. "They are legally classified as the proceeds of stolen corporate funds. The blind trust owns that townhouse, Chloe, and we will be taking it back." Chloe burst into hysterical tears. She turned and began shoving her way through the crowd of stunned executives, running frantically toward the heavy brass revolving doors at the front entrance of the hotel. She wanted to escape the humiliation. She wanted to disappear into the Chicago night. But the trap was already perfectly set. As Chloe pushed open the grand double doors of the ballroom, she crashed directly into a wall of dark windbreakers. 5 federal investigators wearing tactical gear, bearing the bright yellow letters of the FBI, stepped into the opulent dining room. Thomas had made the calls hours ago. We had provided the federal authorities with the complete forensic audit, the forged mortgage documents, and the precise physical location of the stolen Cartier sapphire. "Miss Chloe Sutton." The lead federal agent announced, his voice loud and authoritative, cutting through the chaos of the ballroom. "You are under arrest for the receipt of stolen property and accessory to felony wire fraud. Please keep your hands where we can see them." Chloe screamed a wild, hysterical sound of pure terror. She backed away from the agents, but there was nowhere to run. 2 female officers stepped forward, firmly grabbing her arms and spinning her around. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the marble foyer. They patted her down and carefully unclasped the stolen sapphire necklace, placing it securely into a clear plastic evidence bag. She sobbed violently, mascara running down her face, ruining her perfect white designer suit. She was completely broken, stripped of her stolen wealth, and facing years in federal prison. I watched her being led away, and then I looked down at Richard. He was still on his knees at the base of the stage, completely paralyzed by the reality of his total destruction. The arrogant corporate director, the man who thought he could discard me like trash, was now weeping pathetically on the polished wooden floor. Thomas stepped out from the shadows of the audio-visual booth and walked calmly down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd parted for him in absolute silence. He held a thick white legal envelope in his right hand. He stopped directly in front of Richard and looked down at him with an expression of sheer professional disgust. "Mr. Miller," Thomas said, his voice cold and commanding. "You have been formally served." Thomas dropped the thick envelope directly onto Richard's lap. The papers spilled out over his midnight blue tuxedo. "Those are your divorce papers, Richard." I said, leaning over the glass podium to ensure he heard every single syllable, along with a civil lawsuit from the William Estate Blind Trust demanding immediate restitution of the callable loans. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your credit cards are dead. You have absolutely nothing left. You gambled 30 years of loyalty for a cheap thrill and a stolen fortune. And now you get to pay the ultimate price. The federal agents who had just secured Chloe now walked down the center aisle heading directly toward the stage. Richard looked at the approaching agents and let out a broken, pathetic wail. He scrambled forward, grabbing the hem of my white pantsuit with his sweaty, trembling hands. "Sarah, please," he sobbed uncontrollably, burying his face against my shoes. "I am so sorry. I was stupid. I was completely out of my mind. Please do not let them take me. I am your husband. I love you. We can fix this. I will do anything you want. Just call them off, Sarah. Please show me some mercy." I looked down at the man groveling at my feet. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the supreme satisfying chill of absolute justice. I slowly reached down and peeled his fingers off the pristine white fabric of my suit. "Karma never misses an address, Richard." I whispered, my voice a terrifyingly calm promise. "I told you I would not make a scene at the cemetery. But I never said I would not burn your entire life to the ground." I took a step back and gave a sharp nod to the federal agents. They grabbed Richard by his arms, hauling him roughly to his feet. They spun him around and slammed him against the edge of the stage, pulling his arms behind his back. The cold steel handcuffs clicked securely around his wrists. "Richard Miller, you are under arrest for felony mortgage fraud, corporate embezzlement, and grand larceny," the agent recited, marching him down the center aisle of the ballroom. Richard dragged his feet, crying and shouting my name, begging for a mercy he would never receive. The elite members of Chicago high society watched in absolute silence as the man who had tried to conquer their world was paraded out of the room like a common criminal. The heavy brass doors swung shut behind him, leaving the ballroom completely quiet. I stood alone on the brightly lit stage wearing my father's vintage gold watch and a spotless white suit. The suffocating weight I had carried for 30 years was completely gone. The idiot widow had officially resigned. And the senior trust officer had just foreclosed on the most toxic liability of her entire life. The gavel struck the heavy wooden sounding block with a sharp crack that echoed through the massive federal courtroom. It was a sound that signaled the absolute end of the line for the man I had once called my husband. I sat perfectly still in the front row of the gallery, wearing a simple, tailored black sheath dress. I watched silently as the federal judge read the final sentencing into the official record. Richard stood before the elevated bench wearing a baggy, bright orange prison jumpsuit. His shoulders were slumped in total defeat, and his dark hair had turned completely white at the temples over the past 6 months of grueling legal proceedings. He was no longer the arrogant, wealthy corporate director who had strutted through charity galas and exclusive country clubs. He was a convicted and permanently broken felon. The judge looked down at him with an expression of supreme judicial disgust and handed down a sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and massive mortgage fraud. The judge explicitly noted that Richard's crimes were driven by an insatiable, blinding greed. Richard did not look back at me as the armed bailiffs placed his hands in heavy steel handcuffs and led him through the secure side door of the courtroom. There was absolutely no defiance left in his posture. The grand illusion of his power had been completely dismantled piece by piece until there was absolutely nothing left but the cold reality of his crimes. The fallout from his greed was incredibly far-reaching and entirely merciless. When Thomas officially executed the callable corporate loans, the entire financial empire Richard thought he had built collapsed overnight. The federal government moved with swift and terrifying precision to recover the stolen assets. Chloe, the young, vibrant mistress who had taunted me in the country club powder room, learned a very harsh lesson about the severe consequences of accepting stolen money. Federal agents arrived at the luxury downtown townhouse on a cloudy Tuesday morning. They handed her a court order and gave her exactly 1 hour to pack her personal clothing into a single suitcase. Because the townhouse, The designer vehicles, the expensive modern art, and every single piece of diamond jewelry she possessed had been purchased using embezzled corporate funds. They were all legally classified as stolen assets, subject to immediate government seizure. She was physically escorted out onto the sidewalk, crying hysterically as federal agents changed the locks on the massive front doors. She had deeply believed she was securing a lifetime of effortless luxury and elite social status. Instead, she was left entirely destitute, with a ruined public reputation and a mountain of legal fees she could never hope to pay. Brenda suffered an equally devastating and highly public fate. She had foolishly believed she could act as a secure proxy for her brother's offshore money laundering scheme without facing any personal risk. She had used her cut of the stolen corporate funds to purchase a lavish vacation home in Florida, hoping to live out her days in the sun. She thought she had cleverly outsmarted everyone. But the forensic audit I had uncovered left a permanent, unerasable digital trail that led federal investigators straight to her front doorstep. The government seized the Florida property immediately to satisfy the outstanding callable loans. Because her primary suburban residence had been used as collateral to secure additional hidden debt to cover her mounting legal defenses, she lost her family home as well. Brenda, the woman who had sat at my kitchen island drinking my coffee and offering fake sympathy while actively helping her brother rob my family, was now facing personal bankruptcy and severe criminal accessory charges. The most deeply satisfying part of their collective downfall was watching their unholy alliance tear itself completely apart. When the stolen money vanished, so did their fake family loyalty. During the federal trial, they turned on each other like starving, desperate wolves. Chloe took the witness stand and tearfully blamed Richard for everything, claiming she was a naive victim who had absolutely no idea the money was stolen from my father's holding company. Richard aggressively retaliated by exposing Chloe's demanding text messages, proving to the jury that she had actively pressured him to siphon more funds from the trust to fund her extravagant lifestyle. Brenda attempted to secure a lenient plea deal by throwing both of them under the proverbial bus, handing over every intercepted email and offshore phone record she possessed to save her own skin. They screamed at each other in the courtroom lobbies and hurled vicious accusations through their respective defense attorneys. The charming, loving family dynamic they had projected to the entire world was revealed to be nothing more than a toxic web of shared greed and mutual manipulation. They had tried to build a paradise on the ashes of my life, but the foundation was completely rotten, and it had collapsed and buried them all. I did not feel a single drop of pity for any of them. I simply watched from a safe distance as the justice system ground their arrogant lives into fine dust. The freezing ice in my chest slowly began to melt away, replaced by a profound and unshakable sense of peace. The massive debt had been paid in full, and the traitors were finally exactly where they belonged. Richard will spend the next 15 years of his life in a tiny concrete cell, stripped of the bespoke suits and expensive watches that defined his entire self-worth. He will wake up every single morning to the harsh sound of prison bars sliding shut, and he will remember that he threw away a 30-year partnership, a beautiful home, and a secure future for a cheap thrill and a pile of stolen money he never even got to keep. Chloe has moved back into a cramped apartment with her parents, her high society dreams completely shattered. The child she carried will grow up knowing their father is a convicted thief and their mother was a willing criminal accomplice. The karmic debt they earned was delivered perfectly to their respective doorsteps. The scale of justice was finally perfectly balanced. The morning air was crisp and incredibly clear. I stood on the sprawling stone balcony of my late father's estate, looking out over the manicured green lawns and the ancient oak trees that lined the long private driveway. I held a warm ceramic mug of black coffee, letting the steam curl up into the cool morning air. The massive estate was absolutely silent, save for the gentle singing of birds in the heavy branches. This entire property, this magnificent, sprawling legacy my father had spent his entire life building, was now entirely and legally mine. The dark, oppressive shadow of Richard Miller had been completely purged from these elegant halls. Earlier this week, I had officially filed the final court paperwork to drop his last name permanently. I had reclaimed my maiden name, restoring my true historical identity. I was Sarah William, once again. The woman who stood on this grand balcony was not the submissive, quiet wife who had hidden in the background for 3 decades. She was a fully realized force of nature who had survived a massive inferno. Yesterday afternoon, I had walked into the massive glass-walled boardroom at the corporate headquarters downtown. It was the exact same boardroom where my father had ruled his massive logistics empire for 40 years. I did not take a quiet seat at the side of the long mahogany table, as I had done so many times before. I walked directly to the head of the table and took my rightful place as the new chief executive officer of the holding company. The powerful venture capitalists and industry tycoons who had witnessed my brutal public takedown of Richard at the corporate gala were all sitting in the room. There were no hushed whispers of doubt. There were no condescending smiles directed at the grieving widow. They looked at me with absolute, undeniable respect. They had seen exactly what happened to the man who tried to steal my family fortune. They knew I possessed the sharp intellect, the cold ruthlessness, and the sheer unyielding willpower to command the entire industry. I opened the quarterly financial reports and began the executive meeting, setting a new aggressive standard for the future of the company. I was no longer quietly polishing armor for someone else. I was wearing the heavy armor myself, and I wore it flawlessly. The heavy glass door behind me slid open, and the soft sound of leather shoes stepping onto the stone balcony broke the peaceful morning quiet. Thomas walked out, joining me by the carved stone railing. He was wearing a dark, perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair catching the bright morning sunlight. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood beside me, looking out over the vast green estate. Over the past 6 months of relentless legal battles, federal court hearings, and massive corporate restructuring, Thomas had become much more than just my father's estate attorney. He had become my closest confidant, my most trusted advisor, and my equal in every single way. We had spent countless late nights in his downtown office, poring over legal briefs and complex financial strategies, sharing late takeout dinners, and quiet conversations about the future. "I poured you a fresh cup." Thomas said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. He handed me a second mug of hot coffee, his fingers brushing gently against mine. The brief, simple contact sent a spark of genuine warmth through my hand. It was a subtle gesture, but it carried a profound emotional weight. There was a quiet, mature understanding building between us. It was a true partnership forged in the absolute fires of a brutal corporate war and built on a solid foundation of absolute mutual respect. "Thank you, Thomas," I replied, offering him a soft, genuine smile. It was the kind of real smile I had not felt capable of producing for a very long time. "It looks like it is going to be a highly productive and beautiful day." "It is a completely new era, Sarah," Thomas said, taking a slow sip of his coffee while looking at me over the rim of his mug. "You have successfully navigated an incredible storm. You protected your father's legacy, you secured your own financial future, and you removed the poison from your life. You should be incredibly proud of the strong woman you have become." I looked down at the dark coffee in my mug, watching the surface ripple slightly in the gentle breeze. I was deeply proud. The long, painful journey from the cold hospital room where my father died to this bright, sunlit balcony had been the most grueling, agonizing crucible of my entire life. I had been forced to confront the darkest aspects of human greed and profound marital betrayal. I had seen the man I loved turn into a calculating monster, and I had watched his pathetic enablers try to tear my world apart, but I had not let them break my spirit. I had taken my intense pain and forged it into a razor-sharp weapon. I had used my intellect and my calculated patience to dismantle their criminal network piece by piece. I had secured my total financial independence and reclaimed my personal power. "I am ready for whatever comes next," I said, looking back out at the endless horizon. Life has a funny way of stripping away the things that no longer serve us, even if the process is incredibly painful. The profound betrayal I suffered was a necessary raging fire. It burned away the comfortable illusions and the sweet lies I had been telling myself for years. It forced me to wake up and see the world with absolute freezing clarity. It taught me that my boundless capacity for love and loyalty should never, ever come at the expense of my own self-respect. I had finally learned to value my own strength above everything else. To the women listening to this story, I want you to remember something very important. A woman's silence is never weakness. Sometimes it is just the calm before she burns your house of cards to the ground. We can be devoted, we can be loving, and we can sacrifice for the people we care about. But we must never allow ourselves to be treated like fools. When they push you to the absolute brink, when they try to steal your dignity and your future, do not waste your energy on useless tears and loud screaming. Gather your evidence, build your legal case, and strike back with a cold, calculated precision that they will never, ever forget. Karma is very real, but sometimes she needs a little help delivering the final, devastating blow. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it where you are watching this video, and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below.